Have you ever walked the streets of your city, breathing the air without a second thought, assuming it's just air, clean, safe, and free of threat? Now imagine waking up to find out your own government secretly turned your city into a biological testing ground. Not during war, not in a spy thriller, but in real life. This is the true story of Operation Sea Spray, an event so shocking, so quietly sinister, that many today still haven't heard about it. In September of 1950, the U.S. Navy conducted one of the most controversial and ethically questionable experiments in American history, without public knowledge or consent. Over the course of 6 days, military vessels off the coast of San Francisco sprayed a massive cloud of bacteria into the air. These weren't harmless particles. The Navy used Serratia marquescens, a bacterium with a red pigment, chosen not just for visibility but for its ability to spread easily through the air and possibly mimic a biological attack by foreign enemies. The goal? To simulate a biological warfare attack on a major U.S. city. To study how vulnerable we were, how fast airborne pathogens could spread, and how effective such an attack might be. San Francisco wasn't chosen randomly. It was a bustling urban center with a large population, and its geography, with consistent fog and wind patterns, made it a perfect laboratory for atmospheric dispersion studies. But here's the part that turns your stomach. No one told the residents. No one warned them. Over 800,000 people were unknowingly exposed to this bioagent, day after day, as it drifted invisibly over their homes, schools, hospitals, and workplaces. The Navy justified the operation as safe, claiming Serratia marquescens was harmless, but they were wrong. Not long after the experiment, something disturbing happened. A man named Edward J. Nevin, a 75-year-old resident of San Francisco, was admitted to Stanford Hospital with a severe urinary tract infection. He died weeks later. His blood culture revealed something alarming, an infection from Serratia marquescens, a bacterium that had never before been found in that hospital. Soon the hospital recorded an outbreak of infections caused by the very same bacterium. 11 people became seriously ill. One of them died. Coincidence? Many didn't think so. But for decades, the Navy denied any connection. It wasn't until the 1970s, when Senate hearings exposed a series of secret biological warfare tests conducted on U.S. soil, that the truth finally began to surface. Operation Sea Spray wasn't a one-off mistake. It was part of a larger pattern, an era where secrecy and national security were prioritized over the safety and rights of American citizens. The cold truth is this: our own government used its people, unknowingly, unwillingly, as test subjects in a military experiment. No informed consent, no medical oversight, no accountability. Let's stop here for a second and think about what this means. Imagine you're a nurse working the night shift at Stanford Hospital in 1950. Patients start arriving with mysterious infections, organisms you've never seen. One man is dying. You're trying to save lives, not knowing the cause is floating invisibly outside the hospital windows. No one told you that the sky itself had been weaponized. The most disturbing part? Operation Sea Spray was only the beginning. Documents later revealed that the U.S. Army conducted over 200 similar tests across the country between 1949 and 1969. Subways, airports, military bases, and neighborhoods were exposed to biological simulants under the assumption that they were non-pathogenic. Yet, no one can say with certainty how many people were harmed. Even worse, these experiments raise critical questions that remain unanswered today. What level of risk is acceptable in the name of national defense? Who decides what the public should or shouldn't know? And can we ever trust that the truth is being told when it's cloaked under the veil of security? In 1981, the family of Edward Nevin filed a lawsuit against the federal government, demanding accountability for his death. But the court dismissed the case, citing sovereign immunity, a legal doctrine that shields the government from being sued without its consent. The case was closed. No one was punished. No compensation was given. And the people of San Francisco were left with nothing but the haunting memory of the invisible experiment they never signed up for. Today, the legacy of Operation Sea Spray stands as a chilling reminder of how easily ethical boundaries can be crossed when power goes unchecked. It's a story that challenges our assumptions about safety, trust, and the limits of authority. And while decades have passed, the moral wounds remain open. Ask yourself, what if this wasn't the past? What if it happened again? Would we even know? This wasn't science fiction. This wasn't a hypothetical simulation. This was real, and it happened here, on American soil. Operation Sea Spray is more than a historical footnote. It is a warning. A reminder that truth doesn't always come from those in power. That the sky, the very air we breathe, can become a silent battleground without a single shot being fired. And that sometimes, the most dangerous threats come not from enemies abroad, but from decisions made in the shadows of our own institutions. In the quiet, humid air of Georgia's summer in 1955, thousands of people went about their daily routines, completely unaware that the U.S. military was about to turn their towns into a silent testing ground. There were no sirens, no warnings, no headlines, just one of the most chilling and bizarre experiments in the history of American biological warfare. Operation Big Buzz. This wasn't a weapons test in the traditional sense. No bombs, no bullets. This time, the military turned to nature, to a creature so small it could go unnoticed, yet so deadly it has claimed more lives than any war ever fought. The mosquito. The U.S. Army's plan was simple and horrifying. They wanted to know, could mosquitoes be used as a weapon of war? Could they be released over civilian populations, in large numbers, to carry disease, chaos, and fear? And most of all, could they survive air deployment, find human hosts, and begin feeding as if they were natural-born killers? So, in the spring of 1955, in the heart of Georgia, the U.S. Army bred over 330,000 female mosquitoes, specifically Aedes aegypti, the species known for transmitting yellow fever, dengue, and other deadly diseases. But for this experiment, they weren't infected. Not yet. This was just a test to simulate what would happen if they were. The mosquitoes were packed into specially designed containers. Army aircraft flew low over Savannah, Georgia, and other surrounding rural areas. As the planes passed overhead, they released hundreds of thousands of live mosquitoes into the sky. These insects drifted down into neighborhoods, onto front porches, through open windows, and into the homes of unsuspecting American citizens. Imagine, for a moment, a mother rocking her baby to sleep while an invisible cloud of army-bred mosquitoes descends on her home. Imagine a child playing in a backyard while swarms gather silently, purposefully, without anyone knowing they were part of a living experiment. The results were terrifyingly successful. The mosquitoes survived the drop. They dispersed over more than 1.5 miles in diameter, entered buildings, and aggressively sought out blood meals. In some cases, they were captured and analyzed, confirming their readiness to feed immediately. The Army had proven its point. Mosquitoes could be weaponized. But why go this far? The backdrop of this experiment is the Cold War, a time of global paranoia, secrecy, and the escalating arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The U.S. government was searching for every possible advantage, including unconventional and psychological weapons. Biological warfare wasn't just a theory, it was a very real threat. And America wasn't just preparing for it, they were rehearsing it. Operation Big Buzz wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a broader set of biological warfare simulations carried out by the U.S. military. Operations like Dropkick, Big Itch, and Mayday followed similar patterns, testing the feasibility of using insects to spread disease across enemy populations, or even their own, in the name of science and national security. The ethics? Nearly non-existent. No informed consent. No public awareness. No follow-up health monitoring. These weren't trained soldiers volunteering for a classified mission. These were regular Americans, teachers, farmers, families, unknowingly exposed to swarms of military-engineered insects, bred and dropped like a biological payload. Even if the mosquitoes weren't infected, the implications were staggering. What if a few had been? What if just one infected insect made it into a vulnerable home, a hospital, a nursery? And what if this experiment had gone undetected for decades longer? There's something uniquely disturbing about this form of warfare. It's not loud. It doesn't come with explosions. It arrives quietly, without warning, and makes the very air around you feel unsafe. It blurs the line between nature and weapon, between ecosystem and battlefield. It transforms an everyday nuisance into a tool of control. And yet, the American public remained largely unaware of Operation Big Buzz for years. It wasn't until declassified documents were unearthed, and Senate hearings in the 1970s revealed just how far the government had gone to test biological agents, including insects, as delivery systems. Only then did the truth emerge. The U.S. military had turned its own country into a test range for silent warfare. To this day, no one can say how many people may have been bitten or what long-term consequences may have occurred. Since the mosquitoes were supposedly uninfected, there was no formal investigation. But that's precisely what makes this story so disturbing. The very idea that your own government could unleash a swarm of blood-seeking insects over your community, all without permission, is a betrayal of trust that echoes far beyond the swamps of Georgia. Operation Big Buzz isn't just a bizarre historical footnote. It's a haunting example of how military ambition, fueled by secrecy and paranoia, can push ethical boundaries to their breaking point. It shows us that sometimes, in the pursuit of protection, a government may go so far as to use its own people as pawns. And now, decades later, the question still lingers. If they were willing to do this in 1955, in the name of research and national defense, what are they doing now, behind closed doors, in the name of security? The silence of the sky during those tests wasn't peace, it was preparation. And sometimes, the most dangerous weapons don't explode. They land softly, they crawl, they bite. This was Operation Big Buzz. This was real. You wake up on an ordinary morning, the sun is rising, children are heading to school, adults are starting their routines, life feels normal. But what if, without warning, something invisible had already entered your neighborhood? Not a gas, not a spy, but something alive, tiny, flying, biting. Something released by your own government. This is the chilling reality behind Operation Dropkick, one of the most bizarre and unsettling military experiments in American history. In 1956, 1 year after Operation Big Buzz, the U.S. military doubled down on their pursuit of biological warfare through insects. But this time, it wasn't just about dropping mosquitoes from planes. Operation Dropkick was a more intimate, more precise test. The military wanted to understand how biological weapons could be unleashed indoors, inside actual homes, within American communities, simulating how such a bioattack might unfold in a real war scenario. So, the U.S. Army partnered with the Public Health Service and began releasing hundreds of thousands of mosquitoes into residential areas. This time, the testing grounds included places like Savannah, Georgia, and Avon Park, Florida. Mosquitoes, again primarily Aedes aegypti, the same species capable of transmitting yellow fever, dengue, and Zika, were bred in vast quantities. But here's the truly unsettling part. The military didn't just drop them from planes anymore. They released them into homes, carefully, deliberately. Soldiers would enter households, many of which were occupied, and release cages filled with biting insects into bedrooms, kitchens, and living rooms. They documented how long it took the mosquitoes to find and bite humans. They even measured how easily the insects moved from room to room, through air vents, under doors, across carpets. Human subjects were often unknowingly exposed to dozens of bites during each trial. The mosquitoes were not infected with disease, at least not in these public tests. But make no mistake, the government was studying how to use them in warfare, how to weaponize nature, how to turn ordinary bugs into silent carriers of death. This wasn't theoretical. These were field experiments conducted in real American homes, on real American families. One of the most disturbing case studies came from Avon Park, Florida, where residents reported massive swarms of mosquitoes appearing almost overnight. Some people were bitten so severely they had to be hospitalized for allergic reactions. But the government remained silent. Residents were not told what was happening. There were no warnings, no consent forms. They were simply observed like lab rats in a study too large to comprehend. In the Army's internal documents, the language was cold, clinical, detached from morality. Phrases like mosquito penetration rate and feeding success percentage masked what was really happening. Human beings were being used as test subjects without their knowledge. Why go to such disturbing lengths? The Army believed mosquitoes could be the ideal biological weapon delivery system. Cheap to produce, difficult to detect, and terrifying in their psychological impact. If an enemy could release infected mosquitoes over a city, it could spread panic, illness, and death with no visible enemy and no warning. And the U.S. military wanted to be ready, not just to defend against such an attack, but to conduct one, if ever ordered. And so, Operation Dropkick continued, over multiple years, in multiple cities, all with the same goal, to transform a common insect into a weapon of war. But here's the part that stays with you long after the facts have been read. No one was ever held accountable. No one was punished for turning American homes into living laboratories. No laws were passed to protect citizens from future covert experiments. In fact, we only know about Operation Dropkick today because of declassified documents and investigative journalists who dared to pull back the curtain on the military's biological warfare programs. And this wasn't the only time. Operation Dropkick was one piece of a larger puzzle, an era of experiments like Operation Big Itch, where fleas were used instead of mosquitoes, and Operation Sea Spray, where bacteria were released over entire cities, all conducted under the same chilling doctrine that national security sometimes justified sacrificing public safety. Let that settle in. Let it disturb you. Because the deeper you look into these historical records, the more one haunting truth becomes clear. The people were never told. They were never given a choice. Their homes, their bodies, their lives, all became part of a classified experiment in a war they didn't even know they were fighting. We often think of warfare as distant, dramatic, or obvious. Guns, explosions, enemies in uniforms. But Operation Dropkick shows us a different kind of warfare. One that arrives through open windows, carried on tiny wings, hiding in the very air we breathe. This isn't just a story from the past. It's a warning. A lesson about secrecy, about unchecked authority, about what governments are capable of when fear outweighs ethics. It begs a question we don't ask often enough. If this happened in 1956, what might be happening now, hidden from view, protected by the same veil of national security? Operation Dropkick wasn't science fiction. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was real. It happened. And the people who lived through it never even knew they were part of a military experiment. Until years, sometimes decades later, some dangers are invisible, some enemies wear no uniform, and sometimes the battlefield is your very own home. Imagine stepping outside your home, looking up at the sky, and seeing what appears to be a harmless plane flying overhead. You don't flinch, you don't worry. You continue your day. What you don't realize is that this plane has just released a cloud of microscopic particles. Particles that will descend over your entire city, that you will breathe into your lungs, that will settle on your skin, in your food, and into the very air your children breathe. You don't know this is happening. You don't even know you're part of a military experiment. But you are. This was Operation LAC, Large Area Coverage, one of the most vast and secretive biological tests ever conducted on the American public. From 1957 to 1958, the U.S. Army carried out a series of classified experiments under the codename Operation LAC. The goal was clear, though never officially acknowledged to the public at the time, to test how far and wide biological agents could be dispersed across massive areas of the United States, not just in military zones, not just in controlled environments, but over cities, towns, rural communities, over millions of unsuspecting people. The operation used a chemical called Zinc Cadmium Sulfide, a fine, fluorescent powder that mimicked the behavior of biological agents in the air. It was chosen because its particles were similar in size to real biological weapons like anthrax spores or bacterial toxins. The military told itself that zinc cadmium sulfide was harmless, but cadmium is a heavy metal, a toxin, and later studies have linked it to serious health risks, lung damage, kidney dysfunction, even cancer. These tests weren't small. They weren't limited to remote locations. They were massive in scope. The Army outfitted planes with specially designed aerosol generators, machines that could release thousands of pounds of the powder at high altitudes. Then, over the course of several months, they flew missions across the Midwest and southern United States. Planes flew from South Dakota to Minnesota, from Missouri to Texas, releasing plumes of zinc cadmium sulfide that drifted with the wind for hundreds of miles. In one documented case, the chemical cloud traveled nearly 1,200 miles from the point of release. That meant cities like St. Louis, Minneapolis, Chicago, and Little Rock were all exposed, without warning, without consent, and without any medical monitoring. The Army wanted to know, if a foreign power released a biological weapon from a plane, how far could it spread? How many people would it affect? What weather patterns helped or hindered dispersal? They studied the chemical trails with radar, ground sampling stations, and even enlisted university researchers, most of whom were also not fully informed of what they were really studying. What makes Operation LAC so disturbing isn't just its scale, it's the calculated coldness of it all. The military knew they were exposing civilians. They knew cadmium was a potential toxin, but they prioritized data over people. They needed to know how to wage war with invisible weapons. And so, the American people became the test subjects in one of the largest open-air experiments in history. Some of the most detailed and disturbing tests happened over St. Louis, Missouri, where the Army, under a related program, actually set up dispersal machines on high-rise buildings, including in low-income majority black neighborhoods. These devices released even more concentrated forms of zinc cadmium sulfide, sometimes mixed with radioactive materials. Residents later reported unusual health problems, high cancer rates, birth defects, unexplained illnesses that span generations. The government denied, delayed, and dismissed their claims for decades. Only in the 1990s, thanks to declassified documents, whistleblowers, and a few determined journalists and researchers, did the truth begin to emerge. Operation LAC, once buried under layers of secrecy, was revealed to the public in all its horrifying detail, but no one was ever prosecuted. No reparations were paid, and the full health impact of the experiments has never been thoroughly investigated. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history. You can read the military's own reports. You can trace the flight paths. You can see the charts where they mapped chemical dispersal across entire states. The only thing you won't find is remorse. Imagine how many people, children, pregnant mothers, the elderly, were caught in these invisible clouds. Imagine walking your dog or playing in a park while unknowingly being part of a war simulation. No sirens, no warnings, no defense, just particles falling silently from the sky. Operation LAC was about domination through knowledge, about understanding how to turn the air itself into a weapon, about controlling populations, not through tanks or guns, but through science without ethics. It's a chilling reminder that the greatest threats don't always come from outside your borders. Sometimes they come from within, from your own government, from those sworn to protect you. We live in a world shaped by secrets, but those secrets eventually surface. And when they do, we're forced to ask, how much trust can we ever truly place in those who wield absolute power in absolute secrecy? Operation LAC may have ended in 1958, but the questions it raises remain terrifyingly relevant. What are we breathing? What do we really know? And most importantly, what haven't we been told yet? In the quiet of a mid-century American town, children playing, families gathering for dinner, neighbors chatting under calm skies, no one imagined they were at the center of a military operation. No signs, no warnings, no announcements. Yet from the skies above and from vans parked quietly on street corners, a toxic mist was released. Its name was zinc cadmium sulfide, a synthetic chemical compound that glittered under ultraviolet light, invisible in daylight, but deadly in its implications. It was part of a series of secret dispersal experiments carried out by the U.S. military in the 1950s and 60s, and its legacy is one of betrayal, silence, and enduring uncertainty. The Cold War era was not just a race for nuclear supremacy, it was a time of deep paranoia. A shadow war fought not just with weapons, but with science, secrecy, and calculated risk. The U.S. Army's Chemical Corps, fearing biological attacks from the Soviet Union, initiated widespread experiments to test how bacterial or chemical agents might spread in urban and rural environments. The problem? They didn't want to use actual pathogens, so instead they selected zinc cadmium sulfide, a substance believed to be a harmless tracer, one that mimicked the movement of deadly biological agents when released into the air. But that assumption, that it was safe, would eventually prove devastating. From 1953 through the early 1960s, the Army sprayed this compound over dozens of American and Canadian cities. It was deployed from aircraft flying overhead, from ships sailing along coastlines, and from vans equipped with mechanical sprayers. The tests were massive in scale: St. Louis, Minneapolis, Winnipeg, San Francisco, Corpus Christi. These weren't isolated military zones. These were homes, neighborhoods, schools. In St. Louis, the Army even set up dispersal units on top of low-income housing projects and public schools. Unmarked vehicles released chemical plumes into alleyways and city streets, all without public knowledge. The government rationale? These tests were necessary to simulate a biological attack and ensure national readiness. But at what cost? Zinc cadmium sulfide is composed of two elements: zinc, a relatively harmless metal, and cadmium, a known carcinogen, toxic even in low doses. Cadmium accumulates in the kidneys, lungs, and bones. It's associated with lung cancer, kidney damage, reproductive issues, and other serious health problems. And in these experiments, it wasn't trace amounts being used. It was thousands of pounds of aerosolized compound dispersed over densely populated regions. The Army's own documents reveal that the intention was to track the movement of particles and determine how far and wide a potential enemy bioweapon could spread under varying environmental conditions. One release in St. Louis lasted for weeks. Another, conducted from a plane over the Midwest, was tracked for hundreds of miles. Thousands of civilians, young and old, sick and healthy, black and white, became unwitting participants in what was essentially a biological warfare simulation. What they inhaled, what settled on their skin, what entered their homes, was never disclosed. For decades, the truth was hidden. Even after the tests ended, no health studies were conducted. No alerts were issued. The communities affected were left in the dark, many still unaware to this day. But when the documents were finally declassified in the 1990s, a disturbing picture emerged. Investigative journalists and researchers uncovered the extent of the testing and the specific targeting of poor and marginalized communities. In St. Louis, for instance, the city's predominantly African-American neighborhoods were hit hardest. Residents were told the sprayers were releasing smoke tests for weather studies. In reality, they were breathing in heavy metals. Many later reported high incidences of asthma, cancer, and unusual illnesses among their children and elderly. Some families lost multiple members over the years to unexplained diseases. For them, the revelations weren't just shocking, they were personal. The Army maintained, even after exposure, that the compound was safe. But that conclusion has never been universally accepted. The National Research Council, commissioned to investigate in the 1990s, admitted that while the concentrations may have been unlikely to cause harm, there was insufficient data to rule out long-term effects, particularly for vulnerable populations. Cadmium's toxic profile was well known even back then. The decision to use it was not made in ignorance. It was made in indifference. And that's the darkest truth of the zinc cadmium sulfide dispersals. Not just that people were exposed, not just that it was done without consent, but that it was done intentionally to simulate a doomsday scenario on American soil, on American citizens. The trust between a government and its people is fragile. It is built on the idea that national defense does not come at the expense of innocent lives, but when fear overrides ethics, when science becomes a weapon, that trust shatters. These experiments weren't about readiness. They were about control, about finding out how many people could be reached silently, invisibly, lethally, through the air they breathe. Zinc cadmium sulfide became the invisible fingerprint of betrayal. Its glow under UV light was like a signature left behind by the military on the lives of thousands. A signature many never knew was there, until it was far too late. We may never fully know the scope of the damage. The records are incomplete. Many participants are gone, but their silence should not be mistaken for consent, and their suffering should not be lost to time. Because the truth is, if it happened once, it could happen again. And the skies above us, so calm and blue, have already proven they can become the delivery system for secrets far deadlier than we imagine. Imagine serving your country with honor, aboard a ship in the middle of nowhere, trusting your orders, believing in the mission. You wear your uniform with pride. You follow every command. You do your job. But what if the real enemy wasn't across the ocean, but standing silently on deck with you? What if the danger wasn't from a foreign power, but from your own government, testing weapons on you without your knowledge or consent? Oh, that's not fiction. That's Project SHAD. During the 1960s and into the early 1970s, in the shadow of the Cold War, the U.S. Department of Defense launched a top-secret operation. SHAD, short for Shipboard Hazard and Defense, was part of a larger program known as Project 112. While publicly these operations were labeled as defensive experiments meant to prepare for possible biological or chemical attacks, behind the curtain, they were a haunting betrayal of the very servicemen they claimed to protect. More than 100 tests were conducted across the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, in the Gulf of Mexico, and even inland waterways. The idea was to simulate biological and chemical warfare scenarios in real environments, on real Navy ships, without informing the crews. The subjects? Thousands of U.S. sailors and Marines. Young men, many barely out of high school, enlisted to serve, trusting the system. They had no idea they were guinea pigs. The military released live chemical and biological agents, or their simulants, into the air, onto ships, and even inside ventilation systems. They tested sarin gas, VX nerve agent, Bacillus globigii, now known as Bacillus subtilis, once believed to be harmless, now suspected to cause serious infections in vulnerable people. Another simulant was zinc cadmium sulfide, a toxic compound we now know contains a probable human carcinogen. The experiments weren't isolated. They were systemic. In some tests, aircraft sprayed agents over ships without warning. In others, containers were hidden aboard to simulate a biological attack from within. Some ships were completely enveloped in chemical fog. Sailors went about their duties, training, eating, sleeping, unknowing that they were walking through clouds of potential harm. Protective gear? Rarely provided. Medical follow-up? Non-existent. In fact, most were explicitly told nothing unusual had occurred. The justification? National security. The Defense Department insisted that learning how a biological or chemical attack might affect naval operations was critical. And maybe it was. But what was never justified was the silence, the denial of informed consent. The very people defending the country weren't told they were part of an experiment. Their exposure was classified, their symptoms ignored, their questions dismissed. Many veterans years later began to connect the dots. Breathing problems, mysterious rashes, neurological disorders, cancers. Some remembered the strange smells or odd-colored clouds. Some recalled unusual drills where they were told to stay topside. But they were never told the truth. Until decades later, when the Pentagon was finally forced to declassify Project SHAD in the early 2000s. By then, it was too late for many. Families had lost loved ones. Veterans had lived for decades without answers, suffering in silence. And when the documents did come out, they were vague, redacted, confusing. The Department of Veterans Affairs scrambled to respond. Even after exposure was confirmed, many SHAD veterans were denied proper care. Why? Because the agents used were labeled as simulants or low risk. But history has shown us, simulant doesn't mean safe. Bacillus subtilis has been linked to severe infections in those with compromised immune systems. VX and sarin are among the deadliest nerve agents known to man, and the long-term effects of exposure to multiple agents, especially on ships with poor ventilation and recycled air, are still unknown. The emotional toll was as devastating as the physical one. Imagine realizing your loyalty was used against you, that your obedience, your discipline, your silence were the very tools used to test the limits of biological warfare on your own body. Some veterans describe feeling betrayed. Others say they feel like they were sacrificed, written off as acceptable losses in the name of progress. Project SHAD didn't just test chemicals. It tested the boundaries of trust between a nation and its defenders. And it crossed every line. The military has since said that the data from SHAD helped improve protective measures. Maybe that's true. Maybe some good came out of it. But for the men who suffered, who died, who still fight the consequences today, there is no consolation in that justification. There is only the question, why weren't we told? Consent is not optional in democracy. It is not something to be granted or revoked behind closed doors. These were American servicemen. They gave everything and received deception in return. To this day, many of the SHAD files remain incomplete. The full list of chemicals used, the exact nature of exposure, the scope of long-term harm, all of it remains blurred under layers of red tape. And the number of victims? We may never truly know. Project SHAD is not a distant tale of another era. It is a reminder, a chilling one, of how easily the lines between defense and danger, between protection and exploitation, can be crossed when fear overrides ethics. The ocean washes away many things, but for the men caught in the invisible tide of Project SHAD, the scars remain, and their story demands to be heard. In a time when the Cold War loomed like a silent storm, when fear of invisible enemies crept through government halls and echoed in underground laboratories, the United States military launched one of its most morally complex experiments. It wasn't carried out in secret compounds or remote battlefields. It happened with volunteers, young men in uniform, most barely in their 20s, men who chose faith over violence, conscience over conflict. Their mission? To be willingly exposed to some of the most dangerous biological agents known to man. This was Operation Whitecoat. From 1954 to 1973, Fort Detrick in Maryland, the heart of America's biological warfare research, became the home of this chilling project. The subjects were primarily Seventh-day Adventists, a Christian denomination known for their commitment to nonviolence and pacifism. When drafted into military service, these conscientious objectors refused to bear arms. But rather than simply assigning them to desk jobs, the U.S. Army offered them another option: volunteer for medical experiments in the name of national defense. What followed was a series of trials unlike anything else in American military history. Over the span of nearly 2 decades, more than 2,300 men stepped forward, driven by faith, duty, or the belief that their suffering might prevent something far worse. They were injected, sprayed, and exposed to live bacteria, viruses, and toxins: Q fever, tularemia, yellow fever, Rift Valley fever, Venezuelan equine encephalitis. These weren't simulations. These were real pathogens, some of which could cause high fever, delirium, brain swelling, organ failure, and even death. Every volunteer signed a consent form. Every man was briefed, at least to some extent, on the risks. But what they weren't told was the bigger picture, that they were part of America's desperate race to develop biological weapons, and, perhaps more disturbingly, biological countermeasures. Their participation would feed into decades of classified research. Their illnesses, their reactions, their recoveries, documented, studied, weaponized. The procedures were clinical, calculated. The men were placed in airtight rooms where agents were released into the air. Sometimes they wore protective gear, sometimes they didn't. Fevers would rise, hallucinations set in. Some spent days in isolation, shaking, sweating, vomiting. Others had their immune responses pushed to the edge. Medical teams stood by, not to prevent infection, but to observe it. This was science at its coldest, precise, methodical, unrelenting, and yet they came willingly. That's what separates Operation Whitecoat from the other military experiments of its time. Unlike Project SHAD or Operation Sea Spray, there was consent, at least on the surface. But how informed was that consent? How much did these young men truly understand about the long-term risks? About the possibility of lingering effects, unknown pathogens, or future vulnerability to illness? That's the question that haunts the legacy of Operation Whitecoat to this day. The government promised safety. No one died during the experiments, but that doesn't mean there was no harm. Many volunteers reported chronic fatigue, respiratory issues, or strange illnesses years later. Some faced difficulties starting families. Others suffered in silence, unsure whether their conditions were connected to their service, or even how to begin seeking help for something no one around them had experienced. The real cost of Operation Whitecoat wasn't measured in casualties. It was measured in trust. The Army touted the program as a success, a shining example of ethical human experimentation. They claimed it helped develop vaccines and treatments that could save soldiers and civilians in the event of a biological attack. And maybe it did, but it also blurred the line between science and sacrifice, between patriotism and exploitation. What makes this operation even more unsettling is the moral paradox at its heart. These men refused to kill. They believed in preserving life. And yet, they became instruments in a program designed to prepare for biological war. They became both shield and target. Their bodies were the battlefield. In many ways, Operation Whitecoat reflects the era's defining contradiction: the pursuit of peace through the readiness for devastation. It was a time when ethics were flexible, and fear was the fuel for every experiment. And while these volunteers were treated with more transparency than the victims of other military tests, the shadow of uncertainty still follows them. Because once you've been exposed to something invisible, something engineered to invade your body at the cellular level, something never meant to exist in nature, how do you ever really know it's gone? Today, many of the Whitecoat veterans speak with quiet pride. They believed they were doing something meaningful, something that could save lives. And perhaps they were. But the fact that their courage, their sacrifice, and their suffering were part of a larger machinery, one that also conducted secret tests on civilians, on soldiers without consent, on entire cities, casts a long and complicated shadow. Operation Whitecoat may not have the immediate horror of other classified programs, but its intensity lies in its intimacy. The volunteers were not nameless, faceless test subjects. They were believers, medics, sons, students. They stepped forward because they trusted their country, because they believed in service without violence, and they were used, not maliciously but mechanically, by a system desperate for knowledge at any cost. In the end, Operation Whitecoat is a story not just about disease and defense, but about the human soul, what it means to serve, what it means to consent, and what it means when your body becomes a weapon of war, not by force, but by faith. In the shadows of Cold War paranoia, behind locked gates and the promise of national security, there exists a chapter of American military history so haunting, so surreal, that it reads more like science fiction than fact. For 2 decades, from 1955 to 1975, the U.S. Army ran a sprawling series of experiments on its own soldiers. Men in uniform who volunteered without fully understanding the hidden costs. This was not a singular project. This was a labyrinth of psychological, chemical, and pharmacological testing conducted at Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, a name that, for those who know, conjures fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. Nearly 7,000 soldiers passed through the gates of Edgewood. Each one promised a chance to contribute to national defense by helping develop new protective equipment and medical countermeasures. What most didn't realize was that they were stepping into a living laboratory where the line between defense and experimentation was almost non-existent. They weren't just helping to build gas masks or test decontamination kits. They were being exposed, sometimes repeatedly, to a spectrum of chemical agents, many of which were never intended for use on humans. These included powerful hallucinogens like LSD and BZ, incapacitating agents like ketamine and phencyclidine, nerve agents like sarin and VX, and experimental drugs so obscure they remain classified to this day. Imagine a 19-year-old private, barely out of basic training, led into a sealed chamber where an aerosol of an unknown chemical is released. Within minutes, his mind fractures. He hallucinates bugs crawling under his skin, hears voices whispering from the walls, loses all sense of identity or control. Scientists stand outside the glass, taking notes. This isn't a scene from a dystopian novel. It happened, over and over again. Some soldiers laughed hysterically, unable to stop. Others screamed for hours. Many were left in a haze for days. And when they recovered, if they recovered, they were told to remain silent, sign non-disclosure agreements, and return to duty like nothing had ever happened. The stated goal of the Edgewood Arsenal program was defense, to understand how chemical and biological agents might affect the human body, so the military could protect against enemy attacks. But the sheer scale and scope of the program revealed deeper, more unsettling ambitions. They weren't just testing defenses. They were studying how to weaponize the mind, how to incapacitate enemies without killing them, how to induce confusion, panic, amnesia, how to create a human being so overwhelmed by internal chaos that they become harmless without a single bullet fired. This ambition was especially apparent with BZ, short for 3-quinuclidinyl benzylate, a powerful hallucinogen developed by the Army that could render a person delirious for up to 3 days. Soldiers under its influence often lost the ability to distinguish reality from fantasy, forgot how to speak, forgot who they were. Some stared into mirrors, asking themselves why their reflection wouldn't respond. Others curled up on the floor, convinced they were turning into animals. And all the while, scientists monitored their vital signs, filmed their reactions, and jotted down observations in notebooks. No painkillers, no explanation, just data. Some of these drugs were intended to act quickly. Others were slow-burn agents designed to confuse and disorient. The military believed that in a battlefield scenario, such substances could turn enemy troops into helpless, confused masses. But the ethical price of these experiments was enormous. Many volunteers reported long-term side effects: memory loss, chronic depression, anxiety, and night terrors. Some found themselves unable to reintegrate into normal life. A few committed suicide in the years after their participation, with families left searching for answers that were buried under classified files. And these were American soldiers, people who had volunteered for service, who believed they were doing something honorable. Many were told the tests were safe, that they were helping to test gas masks or medications. Some were offered extra leave time or minor bonuses, trivial incentives that pale in comparison to the trauma they endured. In many cases, the full nature of the substances they were exposed to was never disclosed to them. Even today, thousands of former test subjects are still trying to access their records, still battling the Department of Veterans Affairs for recognition of the injuries they sustained in the name of science. There's something especially chilling about the nature of psychological warfare. Bullets and bombs destroy the body, but chemicals like those tested at Edgewood Arsenal aim for the mind. They rob a person of their inner reality, their memories, their sense of identity, their ability to understand the world around them. These were not just physical experiments. These were incursions into the soul. The Edgewood Arsenal program was officially terminated in 1975, under growing scrutiny from Congress, journalists, and whistleblowers. The ethical landscape had shifted, and the public was no longer willing to accept secrecy in the name of science. But the legacy of those experiments lingers, etched into the lives of the soldiers who were used, the families who never received answers, and the dark archives of military medicine. There are still classified files, still substances whose effects are unknown, still names on documents that have been redacted in black ink. The truth, as always, is incomplete. But one fact remains indisputable. For 20 years, the United States military conducted a sweeping, largely hidden campaign of chemical and psychological experimentation on its own troops. They called it research. They called it defense. But for the soldiers who lived through it, for the ones who still wake up in a cold sweat decades later, it was something else entirely. A betrayal of trust, a dismantling of dignity, a war not on enemies, but on the minds of the very people sworn to protect the nation. This was Edgewood Arsenal, and once you understand it, you'll never look at the phrase military experiment the same way again. Imagine this. The year is 1942. The world is engulfed in the chaos of World War II, a time when nations were searching for any advantage, any edge to turn the tide of battle. This was the crucible in which humanity's darkest experiments would forge new weapons of war. The United States, in its race to prepare for chemical warfare, began testing one of the most terrifying substances ever known to man: mustard gas. It sounds like something from a dystopian nightmare, yet it was all too real. Mustard gas, a blistering chemical agent, was used extensively in the trenches of World War I. Its primary purpose? To cause excruciating burns, blindness, and internal damage. It would blister the skin, blinding its victims and leaving them to suffer slow, painful deaths from respiratory failure or severe infections. It was a weapon designed not to kill quickly, but to maim, to strip soldiers of their humanity and leave them to die in agony. The U.S. Army, in its preparations for a possible chemical war, began mustard gas testing on its own soldiers. The experiments began at Edgewood Arsenal and other military sites across the country. Soldiers, often without full knowledge of the risks, were exposed to this horrific agent. They were told it was for the greater good, that this was the only way to understand how mustard gas would affect troops on the battlefield. They were promised safety, but no one could anticipate the long-lasting effects of these tests on their bodies and minds. The tests were cruel, with soldiers being exposed to the gas in controlled environments. Some were placed in sealed chambers where mustard gas would be released, while others were subjected to it in open-air settings. They were told to wear protective gear, but in many instances, the gas would seep through the seams, causing burns to the skin, eyes, and respiratory systems. For some, the exposure was brief, a matter of minutes, but the damage was immediate and irreversible. Soldiers who were exposed to mustard gas often experienced excruciating pain within moments. Their skin would blister and peel away, the burns so severe that they would often require months of medical treatment. Their eyes would redden, swell, and begin to weep uncontrollably. Many were blinded temporarily, others permanently. The gas would seep into the lungs, causing fluid buildup and making it nearly impossible to breathe. The worst cases saw soldiers suffocating slowly, their lungs unable to clear the damage. But it wasn't just the physical pain that haunted these men. There were the psychological scars, too. Those who survived the exposure would often deal with chronic respiratory issues, coughing, and shortness of breath for the rest of their lives. The psychological trauma was just as intense. Many veterans of the mustard gas tests reported nightmares, severe anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Their bodies had been burned, their minds fractured, all in the name of military research. What makes this testing even more sinister was the utter lack of informed consent. These soldiers were often not fully briefed on the risks they were taking. Some believed they were simply testing protective gear. Others thought it was part of a routine medical exam. In some cases, the soldiers were told they were testing tear gas or other non-lethal substances, not knowing they were about to be exposed to one of the deadliest chemical agents known to humanity. Many of them weren't informed of the full extent of the potential damage, nor were they made aware of the long-term effects the exposure could have on their health. The real horror is that these men were just one group in a long series of human experimentation programs run by the U.S. government during and after World War II. The mustard gas tests, like so many other military trials, were carried out in secrecy with little accountability or oversight. The soldiers who participated were often not given proper medical care or long-term monitoring, leaving them to suffer in silence. And when they finally sought compensation or acknowledgement for the pain they endured, they were met with a wall of bureaucracy and denials. The government, for years, would refuse to recognize the long-term damage inflicted on these men. Mustard gas was not the only chemical agent tested during this era. Other deadly substances, such as phosgene and chlorine gas, were also used in trials. The goal was to understand how these chemicals would interact with human physiology and to develop better protection for soldiers in case of a chemical attack. But the true cost of these tests was borne by the soldiers who volunteered or were coerced into participating. They were sacrificed on the altar of military progress, all in the name of a war that many of them didn't fully understand. The impact of the mustard gas tests went beyond the physical and psychological scars of the men who were exposed. It also raised questions about the morality and ethics of military research. How far is too far when it comes to preparing for war? Should soldiers be asked to endure such extreme suffering for the sake of research, especially when the risks are so unknown? These are questions that still reverberate today as we look back at the history of chemical warfare and the human cost of progress. Many years later, the survivors of the mustard gas tests would attempt to find justice. In 1993, after decades of secrecy, the U.S. government officially acknowledged the mustard gas testing program. The Department of Veterans Affairs was forced to offer compensation to some of the surviving test subjects, but it was a small consolation for the years of suffering these men endured. For many, the acknowledgement came too late, as many of the veterans had already passed away from the effects of the gas. The legacy of these tests, however, remains, a testament to the horrors that human beings are capable of inflicting on each other in the name of progress and national security. The mustard gas tests are a dark chapter in the history of military experimentation. They are a reminder of the lengths to which governments are willing to go to prepare for war, and the price that is paid by the innocent in the name of military superiority. For those who were exposed to mustard gas, the war never truly ended. It lingers in their memories, in their bodies, and in the unresolved history of those who were left behind. The 1990s, a decade marked by technological advancements, global conflict, and an ongoing struggle for security in an increasingly complex world. Amidst the rush to prepare for chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare, one of the most controversial chapters of military experimentation unfolded, one that would leave scars not just on the bodies of those affected, but on the ethical boundaries of military research itself. This chapter involves a vaccine designed to protect against anthrax, a deadly biological agent, an experiment that would go far beyond the lines of what could be justified in the name of national defense. The anthrax vaccine was initially developed in the 1950s, a response to the threat posed by anthrax spores, a biological weapon with the potential to cause massive casualties if released. Anthrax, a bacterium that can form spores capable of surviving in harsh conditions for decades, was a weapon of choice for some of the world's most dangerous regimes. The U.S. military recognized the need for protection against this lethal agent and developed a vaccine designed to shield soldiers from exposure. But in the 1990s, during the Gulf War and the years following, this vaccine would become the focus of a new controversy, a human experiment that left thousands of soldiers questioning their trust in the military system and the government that sent them to war. As the United States prepared for Operation Desert Storm in 1990, the military made the decision to mandate the anthrax vaccine for all personnel deployed to the Persian Gulf. At the time, there was an increasing concern about Iraq's potential use of biological weapons, including anthrax, against U.S. forces. While the vaccine had been in use for several decades, it had not been thoroughly tested in large-scale, long-term human trials. In fact, the vaccine had been approved for use under an emergency use provision, and there were significant concerns about its safety and efficacy, concerns that were largely dismissed in favor of military necessity. Soldiers were told they had no choice but to get vaccinated. Many had little understanding of the potential risks involved. They were promised that the vaccine would protect them from anthrax exposure, but what they weren't told was that the vaccine was still considered experimental by many experts. It was administered in a series of 6 shots, with boosters required every 18 months. The military, under the guidance of the Department of Defense, insisted that the vaccine was safe, though evidence to the contrary began to surface. Reports began to emerge of soldiers experiencing serious side effects. Many claimed to suffer from a range of symptoms shortly after receiving the vaccine, symptoms that included fever, fatigue, joint pain, dizziness, and neurological issues. Some soldiers found themselves dealing with long-term health problems that couldn't be easily explained. There were instances of sudden and unexplained deaths following vaccination, though the connection between the vaccine and the deaths was never fully investigated. But it wasn't just the immediate side effects that raised alarms. The long-term effects were even more chilling. Many veterans of the Gulf War who had received the vaccine would later be diagnosed with a variety of illnesses, including autoimmune diseases, chronic fatigue syndrome, and neurological disorders. These soldiers began to feel as though they were being sacrificed in the name of national security, their bodies used as test subjects for a vaccine that had never been fully tested in the field. They began to wonder if the government had known more about the risks than it had let on. As these health problems grew more widespread, many soldiers began to wonder if the vaccine had played a role. But when they sought answers, they were met with resistance from the military and the Department of Defense. The government denied any connection between the vaccine and the reported health problems, insisting that the vaccine was safe and that the illnesses were merely coincidental. In fact, the military continued to push forward with the anthrax vaccine program, even as more soldiers complained of adverse effects. The controversy surrounding the anthrax vaccine deepened in the years following the Gulf War. In 1998, a group of military personnel filed a lawsuit against the Department of Defense, accusing the government of conducting an experiment on unwitting soldiers without their informed consent. The most disturbing aspect of the anthrax vaccine experiments was the complete disregard for the rights of the individuals involved. The soldiers, many of whom were young and eager to serve their country, had no idea that they were being subjected to an experiment. They were never told that the vaccine had not undergone the proper trials or that its long-term effects were unknown. Instead, they were given the vaccine under the assumption that it would protect them from a deadly threat, only to find that they were the ones being harmed. Years later, the vaccine controversy would be linked to the Gulf War syndrome, a term used to describe a collection of symptoms and health problems experienced by thousands of Gulf War veterans. Though the cause of Gulf War syndrome remains a subject of debate, many veterans believe that the anthrax vaccine played a significant role in the development of the syndrome. The government's refusal to acknowledge the possibility of a link only fueled the anger and frustration of the affected veterans. In 2004, the U.S. government announced that it would halt the mandatory anthrax vaccination program for military personnel. By that time, the vaccine had been linked to a number of adverse health effects, and many of the soldiers who had been part of the initial testing had already been permanently affected. The Department of Defense finally acknowledged the concerns, but by then, the damage had been done. Thousands of soldiers had already been exposed to the vaccine, with devastating consequences. The anthrax vaccine experiment of the 1990s serves as a stark reminder of the lengths to which governments will go in the name of national security. In the rush to protect soldiers from an unseen enemy, the U.S. government subjected its own personnel to a dangerous, untested vaccine, one that would leave many with lasting health problems, physical pain, and psychological scars. The ethics of military experimentation were pushed aside in the pursuit of wartime readiness, and the price was paid by the soldiers who served their country without knowing the full risks they were taking. Today, the legacy of the anthrax vaccine experiments continues to echo in the lives of the veterans who were exposed to it. They still battle for recognition, still seek answers, and still fight for the truth to be acknowledged. The sacrifice of those soldiers should never be forgotten, and the lessons learned from their experience should guide future decisions about the ethics of military experimentation. In the aftermath of World War II, the world was in a state of flux, with new tensions emerging between superpowers and the looming shadow of nuclear weaponry threatening to reshape the course of history. It was a time when humanity was forced to reckon with the destructive power it had unleashed upon itself. And at the forefront of this terrifying new age of warfare was the United States, determined to continue testing the destructive potential of atomic bombs in a series of experiments that would forever alter the lives of those involved. Among the most notorious of these experiments was Operation Crossroads, an event that would forever mark the history of nuclear testing and human suffering. The year was 1946, just a year after the devastating bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the world was still reeling from the shockwaves of the atomic age. The United States, eager to understand the full scope of the effects of atomic explosions, began a series of tests at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, a remote location in the Pacific Ocean that would become the site of a new kind of warfare. What they didn't anticipate was the human cost, not just in terms of the immediate victims, but for the long-term consequences that would unfold in the decades to come. Operation Crossroads was a set of 2 nuclear tests, Able and Baker, conducted in July 1946. The tests were meant to demonstrate the power of atomic bombs in naval warfare and to test the ability of ships to withstand nuclear explosions. The U.S. military's goal was simple: to learn how nuclear weapons would affect ships and their ability to be used in wartime. But the consequences were far from simple, and the ethical questions surrounding these tests would echo through history. The first test, Able, took place on July 1, 1946. The bomb, a plutonium device similar to the one dropped on Nagasaki, was detonated at an altitude of about 500 feet above a fleet of obsolete military ships. These ships were chosen specifically to be targets for the test, representing a collection of vessels that had already seen their use in the war. The bomb exploded with a blinding flash, followed by a massive mushroom cloud that reached high into the sky. The shockwave from the explosion sent ripples through the ocean, rocking the ships with a violent force. It was a demonstration of atomic power, but what was not understood at the time was the devastation it would cause far beyond the immediate destruction. The second test, Baker, took place just 3 weeks later, on July 25, 1946. Unlike Able, this test involved detonating the bomb underwater at a depth of 90 feet. The explosion created an immense column of water and steam, sending waves of radioactive debris into the air. The resulting fallout rained down on the fleet of ships, coating everything in toxic radiation. It was a horrifying experiment in how atomic bombs would affect not just the ships, but the very environment itself. What was most shocking was the sheer scale of contamination caused by the underwater test. The radioactive particles spread across the water, affecting not only the ships, but also the surrounding ecosystem. But the true cost of Operation Crossroads wasn't limited to the ships or the environment. As part of the test, the U.S. military invited hundreds of servicemen to witness the explosions from ships just a few miles away. These men, many of whom had survived the horrors of war, were now thrust into an entirely new kind of danger. They were told that the tests were safe, that the radiation levels were manageable. They were, in essence, unwitting guinea pigs for a new kind of weapon. And as the mushroom clouds rose and the shock waves rolled across the ocean, these men were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. What followed was a tragic chain of events. Many of the sailors and soldiers who had been present during the tests began to suffer from radiation sickness, nausea, vomiting, skin burns, and internal bleeding. Some would develop cancers, leukemia, and other debilitating conditions in the years to come. These symptoms were the direct result of their exposure to radioactive fallout, but at the time, no one fully understood the dangers of radiation. The military, which had conducted the tests with little regard for the health of those involved, brushed off the symptoms as minor side effects, not acknowledging the long-term damage that had been done. The testing was not confined to the military personnel directly involved in the operation. The indigenous people of the Marshall Islands, many of whom lived near Bikini Atoll, were exposed to radiation as well. After the tests, the U.S. government evacuated the islanders and relocated them to other parts of the Marshall Islands. But the effects of radiation exposure didn't disappear with their relocation. The people of Bikini Atoll were exposed to the same radioactive fallout, and many suffered from radiation-related illnesses for decades. Despite the clear and devastating consequences of Operation Crossroads, the U.S. military continued with nuclear testing throughout the Pacific for years. The operation's aftermath serves as a tragic reminder of the willingness of governments to sacrifice human lives in the pursuit of military objectives, particularly when those lives are viewed as expendable for the sake of national security. The health of soldiers, sailors, and civilians, many of whom had no say in the matter, was compromised in the name of testing a weapon that would forever change the course of history. In the years following Operation Crossroads, the U.S. government would face increasing pressure to compensate the victims of radiation exposure. Veterans who had witnessed the tests began to come forward, seeking recognition for the harm they had suffered. They were met with resistance, with the government denying a clear link between the tests and the health problems experienced by the survivors. It wasn't until decades later that the survivors of the tests began to receive some form of acknowledgement and compensation, though many were already long dead from the effects of radiation exposure. Today, the legacy of Operation Crossroads serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of nuclear warfare and the ethics of military experimentation. It forces us to confront the chilling reality that human lives were treated as expendable in the name of science and military might. The survivors of Operation Crossroads are left with more than just their physical scars. They carry the weight of the moral and ethical questions that continue to haunt the history of nuclear testing. The power of the atomic bomb, once unleashed, could never be undone. And in the decades that followed, the world would be forced to grapple with the consequences of what had been set in motion at Bikini Atoll. In the years following World War II, the world was witnessing the dawn of a new and terrifying age. The atomic age. The atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the terrifying power of nuclear weapons had reshaped the global order. But the United States, far from retreating from this newfound weapon, plunged headlong into testing and experimentation, seeking to understand the full scope of nuclear warfare. In the midst of this pursuit of knowledge, one of the most chilling and morally questionable experiments took place: the Atomic Soldiers Program, a dark chapter in the history of military testing and human exploitation. From 1945 to 1962, more than 200,000 American soldiers were exposed to nuclear weapons tests. They became what history would later call atomic soldiers. But at the time, they were just soldiers following orders, many unaware of the true dangers they were about to face. The U.S. government, in its eagerness to understand the effects of atomic bombs on military personnel, decided to conduct a series of tests using these soldiers as human guinea pigs. The Atomic Soldiers Program would become one of the most egregious violations of human rights in the name of national security. The most infamous of these tests were conducted in the deserts of Nevada at the Nevada Test Site, where a series of atomic explosions were carried out. Soldiers were ordered to march in the open desert while atomic bombs were detonated nearby. The goal was to observe how these soldiers would fare in the event of a nuclear explosion, how they would react to the heat, shockwave, and radiation, and whether they could still function in the aftermath of a blast. It was, in essence, a brutal experiment to test the limits of human endurance in the face of nuclear devastation. The soldiers were told that they would be exposed to safe levels of radiation. They were given little to no information about the dangers of atomic fallout. They were told that they would be able to witness the explosions from a safe distance, that they would experience only the effects of the bomb without facing the full consequences of radiation exposure. But what they didn't know was that they were being lied to. They were being exposed to dangerously high levels of radiation that would not only affect their health, but would also affect the health of their families and future generations. As the atomic tests began, soldiers found themselves in the line of sight of nuclear blasts that were far more powerful than they could have imagined. They stood or sat in trenches or on the open desert floor, mere miles from ground zero, and watched as mushroom clouds rose from the detonations. The explosions sent shock waves through the air, and the intense light from the blasts left many temporarily blinded. As the blinding flash dissipated, a cloud of radioactive dust and debris would settle around them, contaminating everything in its path. The soldiers were then ordered to march through the fallout zone, the radioactive cloud of dust and ash which settled over the desert landscape. They had no idea that they were breathing in deadly radioactive particles that would remain in their bodies for the rest of their lives. They were given no protective gear, no masks, no special equipment to shield them from the radiation. They were told to just do their job and not to worry about the fallout. They were told that the tests were necessary for national security. What followed was the tragic and horrifying reality of what would happen to these soldiers. Within days, many began to experience the immediate effects of radiation exposure: nausea, vomiting, skin burns, and dizziness. Some soldiers began to develop severe health problems soon after the tests, but the military brushed these complaints aside. The soldiers were told that the symptoms would pass and that there was no cause for concern. But for many of them, the damage was far more serious and long-lasting. Over the years, the soldiers who had been exposed to the nuclear tests began to experience a range of health problems that would continue to haunt them for the rest of their lives. The most common ailments were cancers, particularly leukemia, thyroid cancer, and lung cancer. The soldiers who had been directly exposed to the explosions, as well as those who had been exposed to the radioactive fallout, became living testaments to the dangers of nuclear radiation. Many of them would die early deaths, their bodies ravaged by the diseases that were the direct result of their participation in the tests. But the damage didn't end with the soldiers themselves. Many of the families of atomic soldiers were also affected by the radiation exposure. Wives, children, and grandchildren of these soldiers began to suffer from a higher incidence of birth defects, miscarriages, and other health issues. The genetic impact of radiation exposure, which had been largely ignored by the military at the time, became a devastating reality for these families. The government's response to the suffering of atomic soldiers and their families was, at best, indifferent. The military denied any responsibility for the health issues faced by the soldiers, and it wasn't until decades later that the U.S. government began to acknowledge the role it played in exposing its personnel to such a dangerous and harmful experiment. Even then, the government did little to provide proper compensation or health care for the victims. Many soldiers had to fight for years to receive the recognition they deserved, with the government constantly dragging its feet in addressing the issue. In the years following the tests, veterans of the Atomic Soldiers Program began to speak out, sharing their stories of suffering and loss. They formed advocacy groups to raise awareness about the health effects of nuclear testing and to demand compensation for the harm they had endured. Their efforts would eventually lead to some reforms, including the establishment of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RESA, in 1990, which provided financial compensation to some of the victims of atomic tests. However, the process was slow, and many veterans who had been exposed to radiation never saw the justice they deserved. The Atomic Soldiers Program is a stark reminder of the moral and ethical questions that arise in times of war and national crisis. The U.S. government, in its pursuit of knowledge and power, subjected thousands of men to horrific tests without their informed consent. These soldiers were treated as expendable, their health and well-being sacrificed for the sake of military experimentation. They were victims of a government-driven experiment that prioritized scientific knowledge over human life. Today, The legacy of the Atomic Soldiers program serves as a somber warning about the dangers of unchecked government power and the cost of military experimentation. The men and women who were exposed to these tests are often forgotten by the very system that caused their suffering. Their stories are the stories of betrayal, of men who trusted their government only to be abandoned when the consequences of the government's actions became clear. The Atomic Soldiers program remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of military testing, one that continues to haunt the lives of those affected and their families. In the midst of the Cold War, the United States was locked in a race for global dominance with the Soviet Union. As both superpowers built up their nuclear arsenals, it became increasingly clear that the consequences of these weapons were far more than just military concerns. They were existential. In this climate of escalating fear and aggression, the U.S. military launched a series of nuclear tests under the umbrella of a program that sought to push the boundaries of atomic warfare. Among these tests was Operation Teapot, a 1955 experiment that would leave an indelible mark on the history of nuclear testing and raise profound questions about human life and sacrifice in the name of national security. Operation Teapot, conducted at the Nevada test site in the spring of 1955, was a series of 14 nuclear tests, which were designed to evaluate the effects of atomic explosions on military equipment, structures, and personnel. At the heart of the operation were tests intended to understand the consequences of nuclear blasts in various environments. Tests aimed at providing military leaders with knowledge that would shape the next generation of atomic warfare. What began as a scientific and military endeavor would ultimately expose a darker side of military experimentation, one that involved human lives treated as expendable for the sake of progress. The tests were carried out at the Nevada test site, which had become ground zero for U.S. nuclear testing in the desert. Located in the remote area of southern Nevada, it was far from the civilian population, or so it was believed at the time. The military had been conducting nuclear tests in this area for several years, and the assumption was that the effects of the blasts would be contained, isolated, and controlled. However, the reality of the situation was much darker and far-reaching. The soldiers who participated in Operation Teapot were given orders to witness these nuclear explosions firsthand. Hundreds of military personnel, including soldiers, scientists, and technicians, were exposed to radiation during the course of the operation. While the military assured them that these tests were safe and would not harm them, the risks of radiation exposure were far greater than they were led to believe. These tests would go on to demonstrate just how careless and indifferent the government was when it came to the health and well-being of its own soldiers and citizens. In the days leading up to the first blast of Operation Teapot, personnel were assembled to observe the detonation. The military instructed the soldiers to remain in designated observation posts, miles away from the explosion site, and told them to keep their eyes focused on the horizon, away from the blast's initial blinding flash. What they were not told, however, was that the radiation from the explosion would reach far beyond the designated observation zones. As the bombs detonated, huge mushroom clouds ascended into the sky, sending waves of heat, pressure, and radiation in all directions. The soldiers, far from protected, were exposed to radioactive fallout that would contaminate everything it touched. Test Apple II, one of the first of the 14 tests conducted, was the first live test in the operation. Soldiers were positioned in a place called Ground Zero, where they were meant to observe the bomb blast from a safe distance. They were told to don only basic protective gear, standard uniforms and goggles, and in some cases, simple face masks that offered little protection from the radioactive dust and debris. For a military that was pioneering nuclear warfare, it was shockingly negligent to have exposed its own personnel to such a danger without proper precautions. As the bombs detonated, the soldiers in these observation posts saw the terrifying power of nuclear weapons firsthand. The heat from the explosion was so intense that it could have easily caused third-degree burns, even at a distance. The blast wave produced by the bomb sent shock waves across the desert floor, and those soldiers who were too close to the blast felt the force of the explosion rattle their bodies. But it was the radioactive fallout, suspended in the air after the blast, that would prove to be the most insidious and long-lasting effect of the tests. The military reassured the soldiers that they would not be exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, but the soldiers' experiences told a different story. Many of them began to feel sick almost immediately after the tests. They experienced nausea, dizziness, and fatigue, classic symptoms of radiation sickness. Some developed skin burns, while others complained of hair loss and internal bleeding in the weeks following the tests. But the military, steadfast in its belief that the tests were harmless, dismissed these symptoms as mere coincidences. What followed Operation Teapot was a widespread medical catastrophe that was hidden from the public for decades. Veterans who had participated in these tests began to experience cancers, respiratory issues, and birth defects in their families. These were the unmistakable hallmarks of radiation exposure. But for years, the U.S. government refused to acknowledge the connection. Soldiers were not told that they were guinea pigs in an experiment, nor were they informed of the full consequences of their participation. But the human cost of Operation Teapot did not end with the soldiers. The fallout from these nuclear tests spread beyond the military base. Winds carried radioactive particles into nearby towns and cities, contaminating the environment and affecting civilian populations. The government had assured the public that the tests would pose no risk, but in reality, people living in the surrounding areas were exposed to radiation for years after the tests. Many of them, too, would go on to develop cancers, leukemia, and other radiation-related illnesses, their lives forever changed by the very government that had promised them safety. Even decades after Operation Teapot, the long-term effects of these nuclear tests were felt by the victims and their families. In the 1990s, the U.S. government began to acknowledge the suffering of atomic veterans. But by then, many of those who had been affected were already gone. Lawsuits were filed, and compensation was sought, but the process was slow and complicated. The legacy of Operation Teapot, like many other nuclear tests of the era, remained largely hidden for far too long, leaving countless individuals to suffer in silence. Operation Teapot serves as a harrowing reminder of the ethical and moral failings of the U.S. military during the Cold War. It is a chilling example of how governments, in their pursuit of military and scientific dominance, sacrificed the health and lives of countless individuals. The atomic soldiers, the civilians, and the families who bore the brunt of the fallout from these tests were treated as expendable in the name of national security, and the consequences of those actions would be felt for generations. As we look back on Operation Teapot, we must ask ourselves, what price are we willing to pay for power, for knowledge, for security? The answer lies in the suffering of those who lived through the tests, whose lives were irrevocably altered, and whose stories remain part of the long and painful history of nuclear experimentation. For them, the price was far too high. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States found itself entrenched in a bitter Cold War with the Soviet Union. The fear of nuclear annihilation hung heavy in the air, and both superpowers raced to develop more advanced weapons, desperate to maintain a strategic edge. Amidst this global tension, the U.S. government undertook a covert operation that would remain shrouded in secrecy for decades, Operation Green Run. An operation that not only demonstrated the government's willingness to engage in dangerous experiments, but also revealed its flagrant disregard for the health and safety of both its own citizens and the environment. The year was 1949, and the U.S. had already begun testing nuclear weapons at the Nevada test site, which had become the epicenter for the country's nuclear arms race. But Operation Green Run was different. It wasn't just a traditional nuclear weapons test. No, this was a radiological release experiment, an attempt to gauge the dispersion of radioactive fallout from a nuclear explosion in a controlled environment. The government decided to conduct a test that would release a significant amount of radioactive iodine-131 into the atmosphere, and the goal was to observe how radioactive particles spread across the landscape, with no regard for the consequences on those who lived nearby. The location for this test was the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in Washington State, a site that had already gained notoriety for its role in producing plutonium for nuclear weapons. Hanford was surrounded by small farming communities, and at the time, the residents were largely unaware of the nuclear experiments happening nearby. What followed in the aftermath of Operation Green Run would be a tragic chapter in the history of nuclear testing. A chapter that was not only catastrophic for those involved, but one that would remain largely hidden from the public eye for years. The operation's primary purpose was to release a large amount of radioactive iodine, 131, into the air, simulating what would happen if a nuclear facility or a bomb were to leak radiation. This would allow the military and scientific community to better understand how radiation would travel in the air and affect nearby populations. But the consequences of this experiment were far-reaching and devastating. What the government didn't account for, or perhaps chose to ignore, was the impact that this radioactive release would have on the residents living in the vicinity, people who had no idea that they were being exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. The actual event took place on December 2nd, 1949, and the radioactive iodine-131 that was released from the Hanford facility began to spread through the surrounding area. The military did not inform the public of the experiment, nor did it provide any warning to the thousands of civilians living nearby. They had no idea that radioactive particles were raining down on their homes, their farms, and their children. Many of the residents in the area would go on to suffer from a wide array of illnesses related to radiation exposure, including thyroid cancer and other cancers, respiratory diseases, and a host of other health problems. The fallout from Operation Green Run wasn't limited to the immediate area around Hanford. Radioactive particles from the iodine-131 were carried by the wind across the entire Pacific Northwest. In the months following the experiment, studies would show that radiation from the operation had spread as far as 300 miles from the site, affecting millions of people. The government, however, did not publicly acknowledge the scope of the exposure. Instead, they remained silent, covering up the results of the experiment and assuring the public that everything was fine, that there was no reason to worry. As the years passed, those living in the affected areas began to report a higher than normal rate of health problems, particularly thyroid cancer, which is directly linked to iodine-131 exposure. But the U.S. government remained tight-lipped about the experiment, and it wasn't until much later, decades after the operation had taken place, that the true extent of the fallout became clear. The fact that the U.S. government conducted Operation Green Run without informing the public, without giving proper warnings, and without providing any protection against radiation exposure is a clear demonstration of the government's disregard for the lives of its citizens. The operation stands as a chilling example of the military-industrial complex's willingness to sacrifice the health and well-being of ordinary people in the name of national security. What makes Operation Green Run even more disturbing is the way in which the U.S. government handled the aftermath. Even as the people of the Pacific Northwest began to suffer from the effects of radiation exposure, the government remained silent. For years, it would refuse to admit any wrongdoing, dismissing the health problems of the affected citizens as mere coincidences. It wasn't until much later, after continued pressure from environmental and public health activists, that the government was forced to acknowledge the link between the experiment and the illnesses plaguing the population. In the years following the operation, those who had been exposed to the radiation began to demand answers. Some were able to file lawsuits, but these cases were often delayed or dismissed, and the full truth of the operation's consequences remained elusive. Even when compensation was eventually offered, it was often inadequate and did little to mitigate the long-term health issues suffered by those affected. For many, the damage had already been done. Families were left to deal with the devastating effects of radiation exposure, while the U.S. government continued to evade full accountability for its actions. The legacy of Operation Green Run is one of secrecy, negligence, and human suffering. It serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked government power and the moral cost of pursuing military and scientific advancement at the expense of human lives. The residents of the Pacific Northwest, who had no idea that they were being exposed to radioactive fallout, paid the price for an experiment that they had no control over. And even as the government continued to carry out nuclear tests, the people who had been affected by Operation Green Run were left to fight for recognition and justice. In the years since the operation, the lesson has been clear. No scientific or military experiment should ever be conducted at the expense of human life, especially when the risks are unknown and the consequences are so devastating. And yet, the echoes of Operation Green Run can still be heard today as we continue to grapple with the legacy of nuclear testing, the impact of radiation on human health, and the long shadow of government secrecy. The people who lived through it may have been forgotten for a time, but their stories serve as a haunting reminder of the price of experimentation and the lives that were altered or lost in the name of progress. The end of World War II marked a turning point in human history, not only because of the victory over fascism, but also because of the horrific dawn of nuclear warfare. The atomic bomb had been used to end the war, but the development of nuclear weapons was far from over. The race to understand the potential of nuclear energy was now in full swing, and the United States, having unleashed the power of the atom, was now intent on learning more about its long-term effects. But in the quest for knowledge, the U.S. government conducted experiments so dark and disturbing that they would remain hidden for decades. One of the most notorious and morally reprehensible of these experiments was the plutonium injection experiments, which were carried out between 1945 and 1947. In the wake of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States government sought to understand the effects of radiation exposure on the human body. At the time, the scientific community had little understanding of the true dangers of radioactive materials, and the ethical concerns surrounding such experimentation were largely ignored. In the name of national security, the U.S. government subjected both soldiers and civilians to dangerous and highly invasive experiments, many of which violated basic principles of medical ethics. One of the most chilling of these experiments involved the injection of plutonium, a highly radioactive and toxic substance, into human subjects without their consent. Plutonium, a man-made element created as part of the atomic bomb program, was seen as the key to future nuclear weapons development, and understanding how it affected the human body became a critical part of post-war research. The experiments began in 1945, shortly after the successful detonation of the first atomic bombs. The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, in collaboration with doctors and scientists at various universities, began conducting experiments on people to study the effects of plutonium exposure. In total, at least 18 people, mostly elderly, poor, and vulnerable individuals, were injected with plutonium without their knowledge or consent. The experiment was carried out under the direction of prominent scientists and physicians at the University of California, Berkeley, but the subjects were not told the true nature of the experiment. Instead, they were often led to believe they were receiving treatments for various medical conditions such as anemia or arthritis. The individuals selected for these experiments were often in poor health, many of them already suffering from other diseases. The idea behind the experiments was to observe how plutonium would be absorbed by the body and how it would affect human tissues and organs over time. Doctors, in their quest for scientific knowledge, injected the subjects with different doses of plutonium, carefully monitoring their condition. The injections were administered without proper medical oversight, and there was no consideration given to the long-term effects of such exposure. The injected plutonium was meant to study how the radioactive substance would move through the human body, how it would be metabolized, and what the potential effects of radiation exposure might be. But the outcome of these experiments was nothing short of horrific. The subjects, who had been injected with plutonium, experienced severe health complications. Many developed cancer, anemia, and other life-threatening illnesses, and some died within a few years of the injections. The full extent of the damage caused by plutonium exposure, however, was not immediately known, and the true effects would remain concealed for decades. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the plutonium injection experiments was the complete lack of informed consent. The subjects were not told that they were being injected with a radioactive substance, nor were they fully informed of the risks involved. Many of the individuals who were injected with plutonium were not even aware of the true nature of the experiment. Instead, they were told that they were receiving a routine medical treatment, often under the guise of a study aimed at improving health. This violation of basic ethical standards, specifically the principle of informed consent, makes these experiments one of the most egregious medical transgressions of the 20th century. The true extent of the plutonium injection experiments was hidden for many years. The government and the scientific community involved in the experiments kept the details of the injections classified, preventing the public from learning about these disturbing events. It wasn't until the 1970s, decades after the experiments had concluded, that the full scope of the tests began to emerge. In 1977, investigative reporters and researchers began to uncover the details of the experiments, exposing the shocking truth behind these secretive, unethical trials. The revelations were devastating. The families of the victims who had undergone the plutonium injections began to demand answers, and lawsuits were filed against the government and the researchers who had conducted the experiments. In 1994, the U.S. government officially acknowledged the plutonium injection experiments as a violation of ethical principles and issued an apology to the surviving victims and their families. The government also began providing compensation to those who had been harmed by the experiments. But for many, the damage was irreversible. The physical and emotional scars left by these experiments would last a lifetime. As the public began to learn more about the plutonium injection experiments, the moral questions surrounding the tests became impossible to ignore. How could the U.S. government, in the pursuit of scientific knowledge, justify subjecting its own citizens to such dangerous and inhumane experiments? The answers to these questions are difficult to grasp, but one thing is certain: these experiments were a clear example of the reckless pursuit of progress at the expense of human lives. The legacy of the plutonium injection experiments serves as a stark reminder of the potential dangers of unchecked scientific experimentation. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the ethics of research, the role of government in protecting its citizens, and the lengths to which governments will go in the pursuit of power and knowledge. The victims of these experiments, who were treated as little more than subjects in a laboratory, were denied the basic right to make informed decisions about their own bodies. They paid a terrible price for a knowledge that, in hindsight, was never worth the suffering they endured. In the years following the exposure of these experiments, there were calls for greater transparency and accountability in scientific research. The plutonium injection experiments helped fuel broader efforts to create ethical guidelines for medical experimentation, leading to the eventual establishment of more rigorous standards for informed consent and patient rights. But the shadows of the experiments still loom over the history of nuclear research. For the survivors and their families, the trauma remains, and the legacy of those dark days serves as a warning, a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked authority and the cost of scientific ambition. In the early years of the nuclear age, the United States government, in its race for global dominance and security, initiated one of the most devastating and dangerous covert operations in history. The Hanford site, a remote nuclear facility in the desert of Washington state, became ground zero for a series of highly classified and controversial experiments that would have far-reaching consequences. The Hanford site releases, which took place from the 1940s to the 1960s, marked a dark chapter in the history of American nuclear testing. The Hanford site was established during World War II as part of the U.S. government's Manhattan Project, the secretive effort to build the world's first atomic bomb. By the 1940s, the U.S. had already succeeded in detonating nuclear weapons, but the true scope of the danger posed by nuclear materials was still unknown. The primary purpose of the Hanford facility was to produce plutonium, a key element in the development of nuclear weapons. And so, for the next 2 decades, Hanford would become the epicenter of U.S. nuclear activity, responsible for manufacturing the plutonium used in the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, in the midst of this high-stakes scientific development, the government's interest in nuclear materials went beyond the production of weapons. Unbeknownst to the public, the U.S. government began conducting secret experiments that would intentionally release massive amounts of radioactive materials into the environment. These experiments were designed to understand the effects of radiation and to monitor how radioactive particles would spread in the air, the soil, and water. But the devastating truth is that those experiments were carried out with little regard for the health of the surrounding population, the environment, or even the workers who were exposed to these toxic substances. The first of these releases took place in the mid-1940s, shortly after the opening of the Hanford site. In the early years, radioactive iodine, a byproduct of plutonium production, was deliberately released into the atmosphere. At the time, the true dangers of radiation exposure were not well understood, and the U.S. government felt justified in conducting these experiments in the name of national security and scientific advancement. The results of these releases were catastrophic, but they were kept secret, hidden from the public and from the people who lived in the surrounding communities. People living in nearby towns and farming communities were exposed to harmful levels of radiation without their knowledge or consent. As the years passed, the scale of the releases grew. The government continued to release radioactive materials from the Hanford site in larger quantities, experimenting with different types of radioactive isotopes, including iodine 131, cesium 137, and strontium 90. These substances are known to be highly toxic and can cause a range of health problems, from cancer to genetic mutations. But despite the growing body of evidence linking radiation exposure to serious health issues, the government continued to prioritize the advancement of its nuclear weapons program over the well-being of its citizens. The town of Hanford and the surrounding communities were most affected by these releases. The winds carried radioactive particles for miles, contaminating crops, livestock, and drinking water. The residents were unaware of the exposure, and no efforts were made to warn them. In fact, many of them were told that everything was fine, that there was no reason to worry. The government's dismissal of the potential dangers would later come back to haunt them. Over time, a higher than normal rate of cancer, particularly thyroid cancer, began to emerge in the population, but the connection between these health issues and the radioactive releases wasn't immediately made. The government's efforts to downplay the risks ensured that the truth would remain buried for years. The effects of the Hanford site releases were not limited to the nearby towns. The radioactive materials that were released into the atmosphere were carried by the wind, contaminating vast areas of the Pacific Northwest. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, it became clear that the extent of the contamination was much greater than initially thought. But by then, the U.S. government had already made the decision to continue the releases, placing national security and scientific research above the health and safety of the American public. Despite growing evidence of the harmful effects of radiation exposure, the U.S. government did little to inform the public or take action to protect the people who had been exposed. It wasn't until the late 1970s that the full scale of the Hanford site releases came to light, after investigative journalists began to piece together the disturbing history of these experiments. What they uncovered was a pattern of deliberate secrecy, negligence, and indifference to the suffering of those affected by the radiation. In 1986, the U.S. government finally acknowledged the extent of the releases, but by then, the damage had been done. In the years that followed, studies confirmed that the radioactive materials released from Hanford had caused serious health problems for those living in the affected areas. People who had lived in the shadow of the facility for years began to suffer from a range of radiation-related illnesses, including various types of cancer, birth defects, and other life-threatening conditions. The long-term effects of the exposure would continue to unfold in the decades to come. The legacy of the Hanford site releases would haunt generations of families, leaving a trail of illness, suffering, and unanswered questions. The government's actions were not without consequences. In 1990, the Hanford Health Study was launched to determine the extent of the health problems caused by the radioactive releases. The study found that people living near the site had a higher risk of developing thyroid cancer, lung cancer, and other diseases related to radiation exposure. It also revealed that the government's initial assessments of the risk posed by the releases were grossly inadequate. But even as the government acknowledged its mistakes, the victims of the Hanford site releases continued to struggle. Many survivors had never received adequate compensation for the damage caused by the exposure, and many of the families affected by the contamination were left with little recourse. The Hanford site remains one of the most contaminated nuclear sites in the United States. Decades after the experiments, the area is still a toxic wasteland, with dangerous levels of radioactive waste stored in leaking tanks. Despite efforts to clean up the site, the full extent of the damage may never be fully rectified. The people who were exposed to radiation, the farmers who unknowingly fed their families contaminated crops, and the children who played in contaminated fields, all paid a heavy price for the reckless actions of the U.S. government. The legacy of the Hanford site releases is one of secrecy, negligence, and human suffering. It serves as a reminder of the lengths to which governments will go in the name of national security and scientific advancement. The lives of ordinary people were sacrificed for the pursuit of knowledge, and the consequences of those actions still reverberate to this day. The victims of the Hanford site releases may never fully receive the justice they deserve, but their story stands as a powerful cautionary tale, warning future generations of the dangers of unchecked scientific experimentation and the ethical responsibility that must accompany the pursuit of progress. In the shadows of the Cold War, when the United States was locked in an intense struggle with the Soviet Union, the government embarked on a series of experiments that would later come to light as one of the most disturbing chapters in modern history. This operation was known as Project MK-Ultra, a covert CIA program that ran from the early 1950s through the early 1970s. Its aim was to explore methods of mind control, psychological manipulation, and even brainwashing in the name of national security. The Cold War era was a time of intense paranoia and fear, with both superpowers racing to gain an upper hand. The U.S. government, in particular, was terrified of the possibility that the Soviets might develop techniques to control the minds of American citizens or to manipulate enemy spies. At the height of this fear, the CIA launched MK-Ultra, seeking to understand the human mind in ways that pushed the boundaries of ethics and morality. The program's primary goal was to develop methods of interrogation, control, and manipulation. The CIA was interested in harnessing any means necessary, whether that be drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, or even physical torture, to break the will of an individual. MK-Ultra's experiments involved testing substances like LSD, among other potent drugs, on both willing and unwitting individuals. The CIA believed these substances could weaken the mental defenses of their subjects, making them more susceptible to manipulation. And one of the most infamous aspects of MK-Ultra was its use of LSD as a tool for mind control. The CIA funded numerous studies where individuals were dosed with the drug, often without their knowledge, to gauge its effects on the human mind. The agency believed that LSD could potentially be used to break down the resistance of enemy agents, or even turn people into spies without their awareness. In some cases, subjects were given the drug for extended periods of time, sometimes in high doses, as part of behavior modification experiments. The results were horrific, with some individuals suffering permanent psychological damage. But the horrors of MK-Ultra didn't stop at LSD. The program was wide-ranging, and its methods grew increasingly brutal. The CIA tested various other substances, including barbiturates, mescaline, and even radioactive isotopes, on human subjects to determine how they could be used in the quest for mind control. Some of the tests were so cruel that they crossed the line into torture, leaving behind victims who were psychologically scarred for life. In one of the most notorious experiments, the CIA brought in Dr. Ewan Cameron, a psychiatrist from Canada, to carry out what was known as psychic driving. Cameron believed that by erasing a patient's memories and then reprogramming their mind, he could cure mental illnesses. His treatment involved keeping patients in isolation for extended periods, administering high doses of LSD, and subjecting them to continuous auditory and sensory bombardment. The goal was to break down the patient's personality and replace it with a new one. Many of the patients who underwent these treatments were never the same again. Some were left with permanent memory loss and a shattered sense of self. While the majority of MK-Ultra's experiments were done on volunteer subjects, there were countless cases where individuals were experimented on without their consent. One of the most notorious of these instances was the use of unsuspecting citizens as test subjects. CIA agents secretly administered LSD to individuals in bars, restaurants, and even their own homes, without their knowledge. Often these subjects were ordinary people, such as military personnel, government employees, and even patients at mental hospitals. These unwitting participants were simply part of the CIA's broader search for a way to control minds. The program didn't just focus on drugs. It extended to hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and electroshock therapy. In one instance, the CIA attempted to use hypnosis to create Manchurian candidates, individuals who could be brainwashed into carrying out missions without ever realizing it. The experiments were highly secretive, with many taking place in hidden locations across the U.S. and Canada. Subjects were often isolated from the outside world, subjected to extreme psychological stress, and manipulated in ways that were both physically and mentally damaging. But despite the horror and the ethical violations of MK-Ultra, the most chilling part of the story is that the CIA was operating in the dark. The program was conducted under the cloak of national security, and its actions were hidden from the public eye. The experiments were considered classified, and many of those involved believed that they were working for the greater good, even if it meant violating basic human rights. The true extent of the damage caused by MK-Ultra wasn't known until much later, when a combination of investigative It wasn't until the 1970s, after a series of investigative reports and congressional hearings, that the public learned the full scope of MK Ultra. The revelation shocked the nation. The government had conducted experiments on unwitting civilians, subjected people to inhumane conditions, and destroyed the lives of countless individuals. By that time, however, much of the documentation relating to MK Ultra had been destroyed, and many of the key figures involved had either retired or passed away. Despite the release of information, many questions surrounding MK Ultra remain unanswered. The victims of the program never received adequate compensation, and many of them are still grappling with the psychological and emotional effects of the abuse they suffered. The program was officially terminated in the 1970s, but its legacy lives on in the public's mistrust of government programs and the questionable ethics of scientific experimentation. MK Ultra's impact on American society was profound, not just in the lives it destroyed, but in the very nature of how we view government control, privacy, and personal freedom. It raised deep questions about the role of the state in controlling its citizens and the lengths to which governments might go in the name of security. The program highlighted the dark side of human experimentation, where the pursuit of knowledge and power can easily slip into unethical and immoral practices. Today, MK Ultra remains a chilling reminder of what happens when a government, in its pursuit of power, loses sight of the humanity of its people. The victims of the program may never see justice, but their story serves as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked authority and the cost of secrecy. It is a reminder that, in the pursuit of safety and security, we must never forget the fundamental rights and dignity of the individuals who make up the fabric of society. In the smoky underworld of post-war America, as the Cold War tightened its icy grip on the globe, the CIA began digging into a psychological abyss that would blur the line between national security and human rights. At the edge of this shadowy realm was a covert operation so bizarre, so morally detached, that it sounds more like the plot of a dystopian noir than an actual chapter of U.S. history. Its name? Operation Midnight Climax. Launched in the mid-1950s under the umbrella of the CIA's notorious MK Ultra program, Operation Midnight Climax was designed with one twisted question in mind. What happens when you secretly drug people with LSD during sex and observe them from behind a two-way mirror? The answer apparently was worth government funding, a network of hidden brothels, and the complete suspension of ethics. The CIA wanted to understand how drugs could be used to manipulate, control, or extract information from people, especially in situations where vulnerability was at its peak. To test this, they constructed safe houses in cities like San Francisco and New York, places that looked like normal apartments on the outside, but were fitted with recording devices, hidden cameras, and soundproofed observation rooms on the inside. These safe houses were run by men like George Hunter White, a narcotics officer by day and CIA asset by night. White wasn't a scientist, he wasn't a doctor. He was a hard-drinking, morally unchecked man who ran the experiments like a voyeuristic puppet master. He recruited sex workers to help lure unsuspecting men, usually working-class individuals, loners, or drifters, into these government-controlled dens of deception. The setup was simple and disturbingly effective. A man would walk into the brothel thinking he was about to enjoy a night of intimacy. What he didn't know was that the drink he was served had been laced with LSD. As the psychedelic took hold, the sex worker would begin probing him, not just physically but psychologically, asking questions, observing his behavior, and subtly manipulating the conversation. Meanwhile, behind a two-way mirror, George White or another CIA operative would watch, take notes, and sometimes even film the entire event. These experiments weren't just invasive, they were predatory. No consent, no medical oversight, no regard for the mental well-being of the subjects, just the twisted belief that the ends justified the means. The CIA was convinced that one day these techniques might be used to extract confessions from enemy spies or to control the minds of foreign leaders. But in reality, they were experimenting on their own citizens, some of whom would suffer psychological damage that lasted the rest of their lives. The environments were intentionally designed to be disorienting. Mirrors distorted space, lighting was manipulated to confuse perception, and the combination of LSD and sexual activity created an altered state of vulnerability so intense that the human mind could barely process it. It wasn't just about the drugs. It was about stripping people down mentally and emotionally, leaving them exposed and seeing how far the CIA could push the boundaries of the human psyche. Some subjects became paranoid. Others broke down. A few ran screaming from the safe houses, believing they were being hunted, watched, or even dying. The CIA took notes. They learned how different people responded to dosage levels, how suggestion could be used during sex to implant ideas, and how easy it was to dismantle someone's mental stability when you had complete control over their environment. But it didn't stop at LSD. Operation Midnight Climax also tested other substances like barbiturates, amphetamines, and alcohol in strange combinations. Sometimes, the goal wasn't even interrogation. It was just to observe the chaos, how a person unraveled when their mind was detached from reality and their most intimate acts were being watched by strangers working for the U.S. government. Years passed. More safe houses were created. More men were drugged. Some women too. And none of them ever knew they were being used as lab rats in a secret war of the mind. The CIA justified these actions by framing them as a necessary evil in the fight against communism. But what they were really doing was writing the handbook on psychological warfare, on how to bend a person's will without them ever knowing it was happening. Eventually, as public suspicion over CIA activities began to grow in the late 1960s and early 70s, the agency began dismantling its safe houses. Documents were shredded. Records were buried. And by the time the MK Ultra hearings began in Congress, most of the paper trail had vanished. But some pieces remained. Declassified files revealed the strange and sordid details. Whistleblowers came forward, and suddenly the American public was faced with an unthinkable truth. Their government had drugged citizens without their knowledge, spied on them during sex, and used their most vulnerable moments as data points in a secret war. George White himself left behind a haunting statement in a letter to a friend. "I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" His words echo with chilling candor, the words of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and felt no shame in doing it. Operation Midnight Climax didn't save America from communism. It didn't lead to the invention of a perfect truth serum. But it did leave a scar on the conscience of a nation. It showed us how easily morality can be sacrificed when fear takes the wheel, and how quickly power can be abused when accountability is buried under the weight of secrecy. Today, Midnight Climax stands as a grim reminder that when a government decides it knows what's best, when it dehumanizes its own people for the sake of some greater good, freedom becomes just a word, not a reality. It reminds us that in the war for control, the battlefield isn't always overseas. Sometimes, it's right behind a two-way mirror, in a room where trust is shattered and the human mind becomes a weapon. In the shadows of early Cold War paranoia, when the fear of communist infiltration ran deeper than ever before, a dark question began to circulate within the highest levels of the U.S. government. Could the human mind be broken, bent, and rebuilt into a weapon? Could truth be extracted like a confession from a drowning man? Or could a person be programmed to kill and forget? Thus began a journey into psychological warfare so disturbing, it reads more like fiction than fact. This was Project Artichoke. Launched in 1951 by the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, Project Artichoke was born from obsession. An obsession with mind control, interrogation, and the terrifying idea of manipulating people without their knowledge. It wasn't just about getting information. It was about creating control, ultimate, unbreakable control. The kind that could make someone commit an act they'd never dream of, and then forget it ever happened. But this wasn't a lab experiment in a controlled environment. These were real people, real tests, real trauma. Conducted in both domestic and international black sites, Artichoke's methods ranged from terrifying to inhumane. Hypnosis, isolation, psychological torture, sleep deprivation, sensory disorientation, and perhaps most disturbingly, forced drugging. LSD, heroin, morphine, marijuana, scopolamine, sodium pentothal, and even dangerous amphetamines were injected or slipped into drinks, often without the subject's knowledge. The mission was simple on the surface, but horrifying in execution. Could a person be made to perform an act, like assassination, against their will, under hypnosis or chemical influence? Could a person be turned into a living weapon, and then be left with no memory of the act they had committed? These weren't abstract goals. The CIA literally documented their interest in creating a hypnotically controlled assassin, a Manchurian candidate in real life. In one chilling memo, the agency asked, "Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation?" That question alone should send a chill down anyone's spine. But behind that cold, analytical phrasing were human subjects, some of whom were unwitting, some of whom were vulnerable, and all of whom were manipulated in ways that would forever alter their perception of reality. Prisoners, mental patients, immigrants, drug addicts, people society had deemed expendable, people who couldn't fight back. Subjects were hypnotized and told to perform strange tasks. Some were told to forget conversations or adopt false memories. Others were injected with truth serums while being interrogated under bright lights. And when they screamed, when they panicked, when they begged for it to stop, the experiments went on. Because this wasn't about ethics, it was about results. One of the most disturbing aspects of Artichoke was the use of terminal cases. These were individuals the agency deemed permanently damaged or disposable. They were pushed to the brink, drugged repeatedly, isolated for days, and subjected to psychological pressure that would break most human minds. Some were never seen again. Others emerged hollowed out, confused, broken. Ghosts of who they once were. The CIA took their findings and used them to develop more advanced techniques. Some of these would later evolve into MK Ultra, the even more infamous mind control program. But Artichoke was the root, the seed of darkness that started it all. It was in Artichoke that the CIA first learned just how fragile the human mind could be, and how terrifyingly easy it was to fracture it. And it wasn't just theory. According to declassified documents, the CIA even contemplated using these methods on foreign leaders. In particular, they speculated about using drugs to manipulate or neutralize enemies like Fidel Castro. Imagine drugging a dictator, or implanting a false memory into a political leader's mind. Those were the kinds of goals Project Artichoke quietly entertained behind closed doors. The secrecy was absolute. Most documents were classified for decades, and many were destroyed outright. What little we know comes from heavily redacted files and fragments of testimony. But the glimpses we've seen are enough to paint a terrifying picture. A government so consumed with the fear of being controlled that it became the very thing it feared. Even among CIA insiders, Project Artichoke stood out for its moral ambiguity. Operatives struggled to define the ethical lines. If torturing one man saved 1,000 lives, was it worth it? What if that man didn't even know he was being tortured? The line between hero and villain, patriot and predator, was deliberately blurred. In the end, the human cost of Project Artichoke may never be fully known. The victims didn't wear uniforms. Their battles were internal, invisible, fought in silence. Many likely died never knowing they were pawns in a secret war, not of nations, but of the mind. What Project Artichoke leaves behind is more than just a chapter in a CIA dossier. It's a warning. A haunting reminder of what can happen when fear overrides humanity, when curiosity outpaces conscience, and when those in power stop seeing people as human beings and start seeing them as tools, data points, and disposable experiments. We often think of warfare as bullets and bombs, but sometimes the most dangerous battlefield isn't on the ground, it's inside the mind. And in that war, truth is the first casualty. In the aftermath of World War II, as the Cold War quietly ignited in backroom deals and whispered intelligence reports, the United States found itself locked in a new kind of warfare, not of tanks or missiles, but of minds. Behind the polished walls of Washington, a shadow war began, one fueled by paranoia, desperation, and a question so disturbing it changed the course of intelligence operations forever. Can the human mind be broken, reprogrammed, or completely controlled? That's where Project Bluebird was born. In 1950, the CIA, still a young agency but already swimming in secrets, launched a classified program that would go deeper into the human psyche than any government had dared before. Bluebird wasn't public. It wasn't debated. It was hidden in sealed memos, signed by anonymous hands, and carried out in forgotten rooms where ethics didn't enter, and truth rarely left. The mission of Project Bluebird was as chilling as it was simple: to discover ways to control individuals through psychological and chemical manipulation, to extract secrets against a subject's will, to plant false memories, to erase real ones, to create obedience that ran so deep it couldn't be broken even by pain or fear. This wasn't science fiction. This was the early blueprint for psychological warfare, a dark roadmap of how far a government would go to make the mind itself a battlefield. The methods they used were not theoretical. Subjects, sometimes volunteers, but often not, were hypnotized, interrogated, drugged, and deprived of sleep. They were tested in high-stress environments, bombarded with conflicting stimuli, and pushed to mental breaking points. It wasn't about understanding trauma. It was about creating it, and then seeing what it could unlock. LSD was one of their early tools. The psychedelic compound, still largely unknown to the public, was seen as a potential truth serum. Subjects were dosed, sometimes without consent, and then interrogated as their sense of time, self, and reality collapsed. Observers took notes in the shadows, documenting hallucinations, emotional breakdowns, and cognitive disintegration, all in the hope of finding a crack in the human psyche where control could be inserted. But Project Bluebird wasn't only about making people talk. It was about erasing what they knew. Could a memory be stolen? Could a belief system be replaced? Could loyalty be reprogrammed? In one set of tests, individuals were hypnotized and told to perform tasks, seemingly harmless things like opening a window or leaving a room. Later, they were asked why they did it. Most had no answer. Some invented excuses. A few became visibly disturbed when they realized they had no memory of their own actions. That was the spark the CIA was searching for, proof that free will could be bypassed. But these tests weren't conducted on machines or simulations. They were conducted on people, human lives. Prisoners, mental patients, suspected spies, those considered expendable. And their suffering was real. Hallucinations led to breakdowns. Memory experiments left lasting trauma. Some subjects never mentally returned from what they were forced to experience. Records showed that at least one American prisoner of war, held by Soviet forces, was the focus of remote Bluebird analysis. The CIA wanted to see if his mind had been altered by enemy hands, and if so, how it could be reversed or weaponized. Perhaps most terrifyingly, the CIA wanted to see if they could create an unwitting assassin, someone who could be hypnotized to kill and then forget everything. That concept may sound like a movie plot, but the documents are real. The conversations happened, the questions were asked, and attempts were made to find the answer. Project Bluebird also tested barriers of identity. Could someone be made to adopt a completely new personality under hypnosis? Could they be trained subconsciously to perform dangerous or covert tasks without realizing they had been trained at all? These weren't rhetorical questions. They were experiments carried out in real time, on real people, with real consequences. As the scope of Bluebird widened, internal CIA memos began to reveal something even darker: the idea that ethics were flexible, that national security justified any means necessary, that if America didn't discover these methods first, their enemies would. And so, the program expanded and evolved. By 1951, Project Bluebird was renamed. It became Project Artichoke, which in turn evolved into MK Ultra, the most infamous mind control operation in U.S. history. But Bluebird was the seed. It was the foundation. It was the original descent into the psychological abyss. And the truth is, we may never know how far it really went. Many documents were destroyed. Others remain redacted. Testimonies from victims have surfaced, but so have denials and obfuscation. What's clear is that Bluebird marked the beginning of a terrifying era in covert experimentation, where science was corrupted by power, and human beings became test subjects in a government's relentless pursuit of control. The name Project Bluebird may sound innocent, even poetic, but behind that name lies a legacy of broken minds, silenced voices, and shattered trust. It's a story not of science, but of secrecy, not of progress, but of paranoia. A reminder that when fear is given too much power, and when morality is sacrificed for security, Even the most democratic institutions can become laboratories of nightmare. So, next time you hear whispers of mind control, government experiments, or manipulated memory, remember that Project Bluebird wasn't a myth. It was real, and it was just the beginning. Sleep, the one sanctuary we all return to, the one state where the body heals, the mind resets, and the soul regains its strength. But what happens when that sanctuary is stripped away? When rest becomes a battlefield and sleep itself is turned into a weapon? For decades, the U.S. military and government-funded researchers have pursued the answer, not in quiet laboratories, but in tightly controlled, often secretive experiments that pushed human endurance beyond reason, and sometimes beyond recovery. Sleep deprivation studies began not as acts of cruelty, but as missions of necessity. War doesn't pause for exhaustion. Soldiers can't afford fatigue in the middle of combat. The question was simple. How long can a person stay awake and still fight, still think, still kill, without collapsing into madness or death? The experiments were carried out in stages. At first, they were mild. Subjects were kept awake for 24 to 48 hours. Researchers measured their attention, memory, reflexes. Mistakes increased. Mood deteriorated. Hallucinations began to flicker like shadows at the edge of vision. But that was just the beginning. The real experiments came later, those that pushed subjects far beyond the normal threshold. In one notorious Cold War-era study, participants were forced to stay awake for over 72 hours. They were watched, interrogated, tested. Some began to forget where they were. Some lost the ability to speak coherently. Others experienced microsleeps, brief involuntary lapses into unconsciousness that lasted mere seconds, but during which hallucinations and vivid dreams overtook them. When they snapped back into wakefulness, they could no longer tell what was real. These studies weren't confined to civilians. Military personnel, especially those in elite training programs like Navy SEAL Beau Days or Army Cirrus School, were subjected to extended wakefulness as part of psychological endurance trials. They weren't just sleep-deprived, they were bombarded with stress, cold water immersion, constant noise, physical exhaustion, emotional pressure. The aim was to simulate battlefield conditions. The result was often total neurological collapse, and yet, it didn't stop there. In the 1960s and 70s, fueled by Cold War paranoia, researchers asked a new question. Could sleep deprivation actually be used as a tool of psychological manipulation? Could it make people more compliant, more vulnerable to suggestion? Could it be used to break down resistance, not with violence, but with silence and time? The answer was yes. And so, sleep deprivation entered the dark world of interrogation tactics. Detainees were kept awake for days, sometimes tied to chairs under bright lights, blasted with noise, or forced to stand for hours until their bodies could no longer bear the strain. Their sense of time shattered. Their minds became fractured. And under that kind of stress, even the strongest will can begin to falter. One infamous account details a subject who, after just 4 days of wakefulness, began speaking to people who weren't there. He reported hearing whispers from behind mirrors, believed his interrogators had been replaced by doubles. When finally allowed to sleep, he did not wake up the same. He had become a shell of who he was, paranoid, withdrawn, permanently altered. The long-term consequences of these studies were rarely discussed. Memory loss, emotional instability, even psychosis followed some subjects for years. But official reports often reduced them to data points, footnotes in classified files. The human toll was buried beneath charts and graphs, beneath discussions of cognitive thresholds and operational resilience. What made these studies even more chilling was that they were sometimes combined with other experiments. Some subjects were deprived of sleep while simultaneously given stimulants, amphetamines, caffeine pills, or worse, to prolong wakefulness. Others were deprived of REM sleep specifically, woken up every time their brain entered the dream state. Over time, their minds began to fracture. The dream world, unable to surface naturally, started leaking into their waking hours. Some began to hallucinate persistent figures, shadows with faces, voices that spoke in rhyme or warning. These were not dreams. These were waking terrors, and they weren't confined to laboratories. Soldiers on deployment, subjected to intense sleep deprivation during extended operations, began experiencing similar symptoms. The military began quietly collecting data, feeding it back into research programs. One veteran described how, after 4 days without sleep during a deployment, he began seeing children among the rubble of a bombed-out building, children who weren't there. Another said he saw a friend who had died months earlier, walking alongside him through the desert. He reached out to touch him. There was no one there. Despite the horror stories, the studies continued. Modern technology allowed for even more precise monitoring. EEGs tracked brain activity. Infrared sensors watched body temperature, eye movement, tremors. The military wanted to know not only what happened during sleep deprivation, but how to mitigate its effects. Could a soldier be trained to resist fatigue? Could certain genes or brain patterns predict who would break first? Could wakefulness be chemically extended without breaking the mind? Even today, in research facilities linked to DARPA and other defense departments, studies continue, though now cloaked in terms like fatigue resilience and enhanced wakefulness protocols. Modafinil, a drug once used to treat narcolepsy, is now studied for its use in keeping troops alert without the emotional breakdowns caused by older amphetamines. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is being explored to temporarily boost cognitive function in sleep-deprived brains. But behind the scientific advancements lies a question that still haunts the legacy of these experiments. At what cost? How much human suffering is acceptable in the pursuit of military efficiency? Where do we draw the line between preparation and torture? Because sleep, at its core, is not a luxury. It's not optional. It is a necessity written into the very code of our biology. And when that is tampered with, there is always a price to pay. So the next time you find yourself fighting to stay awake, drifting in and out of sleep, remember, somewhere, in some lab or darkened room, that moment was studied, measured, pushed to its limit. And someone, somewhere, went further than you can imagine, until the boundary between waking and madness disappeared. Imagine floating in darkness. No sound, no light, no sense of time, space, or direction. Your body is weightless, your mind is untethered, and with every passing minute, you begin to lose something more, a sense of reality, of identity, of yourself. This isn't science fiction, it's a real place, a real experiment, a real descent into the void. And it was all orchestrated in the name of military psychology. Sensory deprivation experiments were never just about curiosity. They were about control. Conducted across decades by the U.S. military, intelligence agencies, and government-funded labs, these studies sought to answer one disturbing question. What happens to the human mind when you take everything away? The first major wave of sensory deprivation studies emerged during the Cold War, an era where the enemy wasn't always visible, and psychological warfare became a weapon of choice. American researchers feared that Soviet techniques of brainwashing and mental conditioning might outpace their own. So, they launched a wave of experiments, using both volunteers and unknowing subjects, to simulate extreme isolation and sensory removal. In one of the most cited studies, conducted at McGill University in the 1950s with U.S. military funding, volunteers were paid to lie in bed in a small room, wearing visors over their eyes, foam cuffs on their arms to reduce touch, and exposed to constant low white noise to block auditory stimuli. The goal was total sensory isolation. No sight, no sound, no contact. Most couldn't endure more than a few days. Some cracked within hours. The results were immediate and shocking. Subjects experienced intense anxiety. Their thoughts slowed, then spiraled. Hallucinations crept in, flashes of light, voices, patterns across the darkness. Some reported seeing entire landscapes form before them, as vivid as dreams. Others described terrifying visions, grotesque faces, whispering shadows, religious apparitions. The brain, deprived of input, began to generate its own terrifying reality. And yet, these were just the controlled experiments. As the CIA's MK-Ultra program took shape in the 1950s and 60s, sensory deprivation became one of its core components, a tool not just for study, but for manipulation. Combined with drugs, isolation, and suggestion, it was believed to erode identity, break will, and make subjects pliable. Under Project Artichoke and later MK-Ultra sub-projects, individuals were kept in sensory deprivation tanks for extended periods and dosed with LSD. Their reactions were documented with clinical detachment. What emerged was not science. It was psychological disintegration. Some subjects emerged unable to distinguish memories from hallucinations. Others became paranoid, emotionally unstable, permanently altered. In one instance, a man was held in a deprivation chamber for days, emerging to believe he had committed crimes he had never heard of. His interrogators gently fed him information until he confessed to events that never occurred. But the experiments didn't stop with the CIA. In the 1970s and beyond, the Department of Defense explored the potential of sensory deprivation in elite military training. The question had shifted, not how sensory deprivation could break a person, but how it could make them stronger. Could soldiers be trained to endure isolation? Could astronauts be prepared for the psychological toll of deep space missions? Could intelligence agents resist interrogation if their sensory world was removed? Flotation tanks, small lightless pods filled with salt water at skin temperature, became a training tool. In silence and darkness, soldiers would float for hours, their bodies suspended in limbo. Some found clarity. Others found madness. There were accounts of sudden religious awakenings, of past trauma resurfacing in violent emotional waves, of time itself vanishing, where hours felt like days or minutes. One Marine described it as a slow drowning of the soul, not in water, but in yourself. The long-term psychological effects weren't always measured. These studies were often buried under layers of classification or passed off as mental resilience training. But some participants reported lingering anxiety, emotional numbness, or even full-blown psychotic episodes weeks later. And as with so many government experiments of the era, full informed consent was often murky at best, and non-existent at worst. The most disturbing implication wasn't just that sensory deprivation could be used to harm or reprogram someone. It was that it could be used subtly, a form of psychological influence that left no bruises, no scars, no visible marks, just confusion, compliance, an altered mind, shaped not through force, but through silence. Even in recent decades, variants of sensory deprivation have been explored in counterterrorism interrogations. Reports from black sites and classified military prisons have surfaced, suggesting that detainees were held in soundproof, lightless cells for days or even weeks, alone with nothing but their own thoughts. The UN has called such practices a form of torture. The U.S. has remained largely silent, and yet, today, sensory deprivation still exists. Not in secret labs, but in commercial wellness centers. Float tanks are now sold as tools for meditation and stress relief. But beneath the calming language and spa-like settings, the core reality remains unchanged. Isolation affects the mind in ways we do not fully understand. The brain craves stimulation. It's wired for input. When you strip that away, even for a short time, the mind begins to drift into fear, fantasy, or revelation. Some find peace, others find horror. And so, we're left with an uneasy legacy. What began as an exploration of the mind became a mechanism for control. What started as curiosity became a method of breaking people apart. And while the tanks and chambers may be silent, their impact still echoes. In the minds of those who were submerged, and in the cold calculations of those who watched from behind the glass. Sleep deprivation shattered the body. But sensory deprivation? That shattered the soul. In the deep south of Alabama, beneath the surface of poverty, prejudice, and forgotten communities, an American tragedy unfolded, not through warfare or weapons, but through silence, manipulation, and betrayal. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a hospital room, a handshake, a promise of care, and a lie. The Tuskegee syphilis study is not only one of the most controversial medical experiments in U.S. history, it is one of the most horrifying betrayals of public trust ever carried out by a government against its own citizens. It began in 1932 when the United States Public Health Service, alongside the Tuskegee Institute, launched what they publicly called a study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. The goal, they claimed, was to observe the natural progression of syphilis when left untreated. But the truth was darker, much darker. The government deliberately targeted a group of 600 black men in Macon County, Alabama, 399 of whom had syphilis and 201 who did not. These men were poor, uneducated sharecroppers, many of them illiterate, and completely dependent on the promises made by white doctors in lab coats. They were told they were receiving free medical care for bad blood, a vague and common term in the region used to describe a range of ailments. They were never told they had syphilis, and they were never told that the study's true purpose was to let the disease ravage their bodies, untreated, unchecked, while scientists took notes. Even when penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in 1947, a full 15 years after the study began, the men were still denied care. The doctors intentionally withheld the cure. They forged documents. They instructed local physicians not to treat any of the participants, even if they sought help elsewhere. They watched as the disease advanced, destroying organs, driving men insane, leading to slow, painful deaths. But it didn't end with the men. The disease spread to wives, to children born with congenital syphilis. Entire generations were marked by a study whose ethics were never in question to those who ran it, because those being studied were never seen as equals. And yet, the experiment continued for 40 years. That's not a typo. 4 decades. Through the Great Depression, through World War II, through the Civil Rights Movement, through presidents and policy shifts. At any moment, someone could have stopped it. But they didn't. Because the subjects weren't just test cases. To the system, they were disposable. Data points, not people. It wasn't until 1972, after a whistleblower named Peter Buxton leaked internal documents to the press, that the truth was finally exposed. The country erupted in outrage. The images of men who trusted their government, who died waiting for treatment that never came, hit every newspaper and television screen. The betrayal was too large to ignore, and for the first time, the world saw what had been hidden in the quiet fields of Tuskegee. An official investigation followed. Lawsuits were filed. In 1974, a $10 million out-of-court settlement was reached, and the U.S. government promised lifetime medical benefits and burial services to all living participants and their immediate families. But how do you repay decades of suffering? How do you compensate for the lives lost, the families shattered, the children born into pain that could have been prevented? In 1997, 25 years after the study ended, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. In his words, "What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry." But even that moment, as powerful as it was, could never erase the scars. Because the legacy of the Tuskegee syphilis study is not just historical, it lives on today. It lives in the mistrust many communities of color feel toward medical institutions. It lives in the fear of being experimented on. It lives in the silence between doctor and patient, where truth must now be questioned. And perhaps most chilling of all, it serves as a reminder that science without ethics, medicine without humanity, and research without consent can become something monstrous, something capable of destroying lives in the name of knowledge. The Tuskegee syphilis study wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern where the vulnerable are used, where transparency is replaced by secrecy, and where the promise of care becomes a weapon. It teaches us that the greatest horrors aren't always found in warfare. Sometimes, they're found in a quiet room, under fluorescent lights, where trust is broken and no one is watching, but someone should have been. In the searing heat of the Persian Gulf, under skies filled with smoke and the distant thunder of bombing raids, a new kind of weapon was being unleashed. It was sleek, powerful, and devastatingly effective. A technological marvel, they said, but hidden within its strength was a silent poison, invisible, odorless, and deadly. This was the era of the Gulf War, and this was the story of depleted uranium. At first glance, depleted uranium, or DU, sounds innocuous. It's the byproduct of enriching uranium for nuclear fuel or weapons. It's less radioactive than natural uranium. But what makes DU so dangerous is not just its radiation, it's its toxic heaviness. And the U.S. military saw its potential. Shaped into the tips of armor-piercing munitions, DU rounds could punch through tanks like a knife through paper. When they hit their target, the rounds ignited, burning at extreme temperatures, vaporizing into fine radioactive dust that could linger in the air, settle into the soil, and be inhaled by anyone nearby. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, U.S. forces fired hundreds of tons of depleted uranium rounds. They shattered enemy armor with ease. The battlefield was a victory, but no one realized that the real battle had just begun. It was not a battle of bullets anymore. It was cellular, biological, unseen, and it didn't end when the fighting stopped. Soon after, American soldiers began reporting strange symptoms: chronic fatigue, joint pain, skin rashes, memory problems, nausea, cancers that shouldn't have developed so quickly, babies born with deformities, and they weren't alone. Iraqi civilians living near the bombed-out sites suffered similar, sometimes worse, consequences. It didn't take long before the phrase Gulf War Syndrome entered the public conversation, a vague umbrella term for something no one could fully explain, but something very real. Depleted uranium became a prime suspect. In a battlefield soaked with chemicals, oil fires, nerve agents, vaccinations, pinpointing a single cause was difficult. The Pentagon pushed back. They insisted DU posed no significant health risk. They claimed the particles were too heavy to remain airborne long, too weak to cause radiation sickness. But science was starting to say otherwise. Independent researchers, veterans groups, and investigative journalists dug deeper. They found contamination around impact sites, DU dust in soil, in water, in the lungs of exposed individuals. Autopsies revealed traces of uranium in bones and organs. The U.S. military had never warned troops about DU exposure. Many were not equipped with masks or protective gear. Soldiers ate near wreckage, slept in tanks struck by DU rounds, and were never decontaminated. Some were even ordered to handle the wreckage without any awareness of what they were touching. And that ignorance wasn't limited to American forces. In Basra and Fallujah, birth defects surged in the years following the war. Children were born with missing limbs, elongated heads, or organs outside their bodies. Iraqi doctors sounded the alarm, begging for international assistance, linking the deformities to radiation exposure. But they were largely ignored, dismissed, silenced. Even as the U.S. prepared for its second war in Iraq in 2003, depleted uranium was once again loaded onto jets and tanks. And again, the warnings were overlooked. This was not simply an environmental catastrophe. It was a human rights question, a question of accountability, of truth. Why were soldiers not told what they were being exposed to? Why were civilians left to suffer in silence? And why did it take decades for the government to even acknowledge that DU might be part of the problem? In 2004, the United Nations called for studies into depleted uranium and its effects on health and the environment. But the military's stonewalling continued. Veterans who spoke out were discredited, scientists were threatened, and evidence was buried under layers of bureaucracy and classified files. Even today, the full impact of depleted uranium remains a haunting mystery. We still don't know the long-term consequences for the children of soldiers, or for the populations that lived and died in DU-contaminated war zones. And that uncertainty is the most chilling part of all, because this wasn't just a weapon used against enemies. It was a weapon that came home with us. It lingered in our bodies, in our blood, in our families. This wasn't just a casualty of war. It was a decision, a deliberate risk taken without informed consent. And the price is still being paid, quietly, invisibly, one breath, one diagnosis, one lost child at a time. Depleted uranium did not make headlines like missiles or drone strikes, but its impact might outlast them all. It asks us to reconsider the true meaning of victory, to question how we define success when the weapons we use leave a legacy of disease, decay, and death that no one claims responsibility for. In the dense jungles of Vietnam, where the trees grew thick and the undergrowth seemed endless, the U.S. military faced an invisible enemy, guerrilla warfare, ambushes, booby traps, and tunnels buried beneath the earth. The Viet Cong didn't need to overpower their enemies with firepower. They used the jungle itself as a shield, as a weapon. And to break that shield, America turned to science. To chemistry, to a weapon that would change history forever. It was called Agent Orange. It didn't explode, it didn't detonate. It didn't scream through the air or light up the sky. No, Agent Orange fell silently, sprayed from planes that cut slow trails across the horizon, dumped from helicopters like rain over the forests. It was a herbicide, a defoliant. Its purpose was simple and cold: to kill vegetation, strip the jungle bare, expose the enemy. And in that mission, it succeeded. But what the U.S. government didn't publicly say, or maybe didn't fully understand, was that Agent Orange was more than just a tool to burn leaves and roots. It was laced with one of the most dangerous chemicals ever created by man: dioxin. A compound so toxic, so persistent in the environment, that even the smallest dose could lead to birth defects, cancers, and genetic mutations. Between 1962 and 1971, the U.S. military sprayed over 20 million gallons of herbicides in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Of that, Agent Orange made up the bulk. It was part of Operation Ranch Hand, a military program designed to starve the Viet Cong of cover and crops. But what they sprayed didn't just kill trees. It seeped into the water, it settled into the soil, it clung to the skin and uniforms of American troops, and it rained down on Vietnamese villages where no enemy soldiers lived. Children played under the residue, farmers worked the poisoned earth, pregnant women drank from contaminated streams. No warning was given. No antidote was offered. The destruction was not limited to combatants. It was indiscriminate, silent, and merciless. American veterans returned home with symptoms doctors couldn't explain: aggressive cancers, neurological disorders, skin lesions that wouldn't heal. Children born to veterans began arriving with missing limbs, twisted spines, and deformities that defied understanding. But even then, the connection to Agent Orange was dismissed, ignored, buried. The Department of Defense denied culpability. The chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange, most famously Monsanto and Dow Chemical, insisted their product was safe. But behind closed doors, internal memos told another story. As early as the 1960s, scientists knew dioxin was dangerous. They warned of long-term health effects. Yet, the spraying continued. The denials persisted. It wasn't just the veterans who suffered. In Vietnam, the damage was catastrophic. Generations of children have been born with severe disabilities. Entire regions remain poisoned. Soil where nothing grows, lakes where no fish swim. In some villages, as many as 1 in every 5 children is born with birth defects. The haunting legacy of Agent Orange is not just a story of past warfare, it's an ongoing tragedy. And still, there was no accountability. It took decades for the U.S. government to even acknowledge the link between Agent Orange and the suffering of its own soldiers. Veterans had to fight tooth and nail for compensation. Many died waiting. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, aid was almost non-existent. The land was left scarred, the people abandoned. One haunting image remains etched in the minds of those who witnessed the aftermath: children born without eyes, infants with spinal columns on the outside of their bodies, teenagers confined to wheelchairs, their bones brittle, their minds forever young. This wasn't just collateral damage. This was the result of a calculated choice, a decision made in war rooms and laboratories to unleash a chemical so destructive that it changed the genetic future of 2 nations. Not a bomb, not a bullet, but a liquid, a poison, a slow, relentless execution of life. Today, the scars of Agent Orange are still visible. The children born long after the war still bear its burden. Veterans, now elderly, continue to fight for recognition and justice. And yet, many Americans still don't know this story, or understand the full horror of what happened. Because the tragedy of Agent Orange isn't just what it did to the trees. It's what it did to the people, to the unborn, to the forgotten. It's a reminder that some weapons don't make noise. They don't explode or scream. They whisper. They linger. They alter DNA and echo for generations. And perhaps the most terrifying truth of all is that it was all done knowingly. Agent Orange wasn't an accident. It was a choice, and millions paid the price. In the early 1990s, a war that was supposed to be quick and decisive for the United States would end up leaving behind a legacy far darker than anyone could have anticipated. It was a conflict known as the Gulf War, a war fought in the deserts of Iraq and Kuwait, with American and coalition forces battling Saddam Hussein's regime. It was, at least on the surface, a clean victory for the United States, a war that lasted only 100 hours of ground combat. But for thousands of American soldiers, this war would never truly end. Instead, it would mark the beginning of a personal battle, one that would take years to recognize, and even longer to understand. This battle is what we now know as Gulf War syndrome, a condition that affected thousands of veterans, many of whom came back from the war only to find their bodies, minds, and lives deteriorating in ways that no one could explain. Symptoms ranged from chronic fatigue, muscle pain, and memory loss to rashes, headaches, and severe respiratory problems. These soldiers, once strong and proud, became shadows of themselves, their health slowly, inexplicably deteriorating in the years following their return home. But the problem wasn't just the symptoms. The real horror lay in the mystery that surrounded the cause of this illness. Was it the result of exposure to toxic chemicals during the war? Or was it psychological trauma, a post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, response to the horrors they had witnessed in the desert? Were these soldiers suffering from a hidden biological agent, perhaps something they were exposed to while in Iraq or Kuwait? No one knew. And for years, no one seemed to want to know. The early signs of Gulf War syndrome appeared almost immediately after the war ended. Veterans began to report a wide array of symptoms, many of which had no clear medical explanation. Some claimed they felt a persistent fatigue, as though their bodies were constantly drained of energy, no matter how much they slept. Others suffered from debilitating headaches that wouldn't go away, while some experienced strange rashes that seemed to have no cause. But it wasn't just physical symptoms that plagued these soldiers. Many veterans also began reporting cognitive issues, memory loss, an inability to concentrate, and feelings of confusion. Yet, despite the growing number of veterans coming forward with these complaints, the U.S. government and military were slow to act. Initially, many of these soldiers were dismissed. Doctors labeled their symptoms as a result of stress or combat fatigue, something that would dissipate with time. But as the years went on and more veterans began reporting these strange symptoms, the situation became harder to ignore. In the mid-1990s, as the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, and the U.S. government tried to make sense of the increasing number of cases, theories began to emerge. The possibility that Gulf War syndrome was the result of exposure to toxic substances became a central focus. One of the prime suspects was the ubiquitous use of pyridostigmine bromide, a drug given to soldiers as a protective measure against nerve agents in case of a chemical weapons attack. The drug, used by thousands of U.S. troops, was supposed to help counter the effects of chemical weapons like sarin gas. But research would later suggest that this drug could be a double-edged sword, potentially contributing to the symptoms of Gulf War syndrome when combined with other factors. Another major culprit suspected to have contributed to Gulf War syndrome was the widespread use of pesticides. In an effort to protect U.S. troops from insects that might carry diseases like malaria, soldiers were repeatedly exposed to toxic insecticides. These chemicals, when combined with other exposures, such as burning oil wells, fumes from depleted uranium ammunition, and anthrax vaccinations, seemed to create a toxic cocktail that many veterans believed had a significant role in causing their symptoms. But it wasn't just the chemicals. Burn pits used throughout the war to dispose of waste were also believed to have played a major role. These pits were a common sight in military bases, where trash, chemicals, and even medical waste were burned, releasing toxic smoke into the air. For years, soldiers breathed in the fumes, not realizing that this exposure could be contributing to the illnesses they would later suffer. The particulate matter in the smoke could have caused chronic respiratory problems, and studies would eventually confirm that veterans who had been exposed to these burn pits were more likely to suffer from diseases like cancer and respiratory disorders. As the years passed, the number of affected veterans grew, and the toll on their mental and physical health became more evident. But the scientific community struggled to keep up. No definitive cause was found, and many doctors dismissed the symptoms as psychosomatic, a result of stress from the war. It wasn't until 1999, when the Institute of Medicine, IOM, conducted a thorough investigation into Gulf War syndrome, that they began to connect the dots between the various exposures and the symptoms that veterans were experiencing. Despite the IOM report, there was still a reluctance to fully recognize Gulf War syndrome as a real, diagnosable condition. The U.S. government, for a long time, did not offer the level of support and compensation that veterans had hoped for. The Veterans Affairs Administration was slow to acknowledge the severity of the issue, and veterans continued to feel abandoned and dismissed. The emotional toll of being denied care and support was just as devastating as the physical symptoms they were enduring. Many Gulf War veterans felt forgotten, their suffering marginalized. In 2004, the U.S. government finally recognized Gulf War syndrome as a legitimate issue and began offering compensation to affected veterans. But by then, the damage had been done. Thousands of soldiers who had been exposed to toxic substances were still struggling with their health, and many had already passed away without ever receiving recognition for their suffering. As the years went on, more research continued to surface, pointing to the long-term effects of the war. Studies found that the chemicals soldiers were exposed to could not only cause immediate physical harm, but also have lasting genetic impacts. Veterans who had children following their service reported higher rates of birth defects and other health problems in their offspring. This added another layer of tragedy to the already devastating story of Gulf War syndrome. The children of these veterans were also suffering. Today, the veterans of the Gulf War continue to struggle. Many of them, now in their 50s and 60s, are still fighting to get the care they deserve. And as for the cause of Gulf War syndrome, while much more has been uncovered, the true extent of the harm caused by these toxic exposures remains unclear. The legacy of the Gulf War, a war fought in the sands of Iraq and Kuwait, is still unfolding, as those who served in it continue to battle the unseen wounds of their service. Gulf War syndrome is a reminder that the invisible wounds of war often last far longer than the battles themselves. It is a tragic testament to the horrors of toxic exposure, to the dangers of chemical warfare, and to the enduring suffering of those who fight on foreign soil. And for those veterans who fought bravely in the Gulf War, the fight for recognition and justice is far from over. During the turbulent 1960s and early 1970s, a time when the United States was grappling with social upheaval, civil rights movements, and the ongoing Vietnam War, the government took drastic and often secretive actions to monitor and control the rising tide of dissent. One of the most controversial and covert operations that emerged from this period was Operation Chaos, a covert CIA program aimed at infiltrating, surveilling, and undermining the anti-war movement, civil rights activists, and even student groups. What began as an attempt to gather intelligence about foreign influence in the United States would evolve into something far more dangerous and invasive, an operation that blurred the lines between national security and the rights of American citizens. By the mid-1960s, as the Vietnam War raged on, the U.S. government was facing increasing public opposition to its military involvement. Protests were growing larger, fueled by a new generation of young people who were determined to speak out against what they saw as an unjust war. At the same time, the civil rights movement was in full swing, challenging the systemic oppression of Black Americans and demanding change. For the U.S. government, these movements posed a significant challenge, not just to the war effort, but to the status quo. In response, the CIA, whose job was primarily to gather intelligence overseas, was given a new and controversial directive: monitor these domestic movements, infiltrate them, and determine if they were being influenced or manipulated by foreign powers, particularly the Soviet Union or Communist China. What began as a limited operation aimed at foreign infiltration soon spiraled into a full-fledged surveillance campaign against American citizens, many of whom were simply exercising their constitutional right to free speech. Operation Chaos officially began in 1967, but it wasn't until 1970 that it was formally codified. The program was designed to infiltrate groups that were deemed subversive, anti-American, or potentially linked to communist influences. This included not only groups protesting the Vietnam War, but also civil rights organizations, student activists, and left-wing organizations. In many cases, these groups were peaceful, advocating for change through lawful protest and civil disobedience. However, the CIA operated under the belief that some of these organizations were being manipulated by foreign agents, and as a result, they viewed their actions as subversive threats to national security. The methods used by the CIA during Operation Chaos were both extensive and invasive. The agency engaged in warrantless surveillance of American citizens, tapping phones, intercepting mail, and compiling dossiers on individuals and organizations they deemed dangerous. They didn't just stop at surveillance. They also sought to infiltrate these groups by recruiting informants or even planting undercover agents. Some agents went so far as to pose as participants in protests or meetings, all while gathering intelligence on the movements and their leaders. One of the most significant targets of Operation Chaos was the anti-Vietnam War movement. Protests against the war were spreading across college campuses, and the government viewed these protests as a serious threat to the war effort. Thousands of students participated in protests, marches, and sit-ins, demanding that the U.S. end its involvement in Vietnam. The CIA believed that some of these protests were being coordinated or funded by foreign adversaries, particularly the Soviet Union. As a result, they sought to identify the leaders of these movements and gather any information that could link them to foreign governments. But it wasn't just the anti-war activists who were targeted. Civil rights organizations also came under intense scrutiny. The CIA believed that groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, might be involved in activities that threatened the national security of the United States. The government was particularly concerned about the rising militancy within the civil rights movement, especially as leaders like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael began advocating for more radical and confrontational tactics. While the vast majority of civil rights groups remained nonviolent, the government feared that some members might be influenced by communist ideologies, or worse, working with foreign agents to destabilize the United States. In an effort to maintain control over the narrative, the CIA even engaged in disinformation campaigns designed to discredit and disband these movements. They would spread rumors, plant fake stories in the media, and even attempt to pit groups against each other. These efforts were often covert, with the CIA working behind the scenes to influence public perception. If the public believed that anti-war activists or civil rights groups were being funded by foreign governments, it would be easier to justify the crackdown on these movements. While Operation Chaos was initially intended to monitor foreign influence, it quickly became clear that the CIA had crossed a line. The scope of the operation had expanded to the point where the agency was not just monitoring foreign ties, but actively surveilling and suppressing domestic political movements. Thousands of Americans were affected by the program, their privacy violated in the name of national security. Many of these individuals had no connection to foreign governments or communist influences. They were simply exercising their rights to protest and speak out against government policies. The program came under increasing scrutiny in the early 1970s. Whistleblowers, activists, and journalists began to expose the extent of the CIA's involvement in domestic surveillance, leading to public outcry. The Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church, was formed to investigate the CIA's domestic activities. The committee uncovered a range of illegal and unethical practices, including illegal wiretaps, mail interceptions, and covert infiltration of political groups. The committee also revealed that the CIA had gone beyond mere surveillance, actively attempting to manipulate and control public opinion through disinformation. In the end, Operation Chaos was officially shut down in 1974. The operation had achieved its goal of monitoring and infiltrating anti-war and civil rights movements, but the ethical and legal ramifications were too severe to ignore. The public outcry over the operation marked a turning point in the relationship between the government and its citizens. It exposed the dangers of unchecked government power, particularly when it comes to surveillance and domestic intelligence gathering. However, the legacy of Operation Chaos remains relevant today. The surveillance of domestic political movements has continued in various forms, sometimes under the guise of counterterrorism or national security. The balance between national security and civil liberties remains a point of intense debate, particularly in the digital age, where surveillance technologies are more sophisticated than ever. The history of Operation Chaos serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of government overreach and the consequences of violating the rights of individuals in the name of national security. For the activists, the students, and the civil rights leaders who were targeted, the scars left by this operation are still felt today. Many of them were innocent, caught in the crossfire of a government determined to maintain control. The only question that remains is whether we have truly learned from this dark chapter in history, or if we will continue to allow our rights to be compromised in the name of security. The Vietnam War, one of the most controversial and painful conflicts in modern history, was not only a military struggle, but also a battle for hearts and minds. Amidst the jungle warfare, bombings, and battles that defined the conflict, the the U.S. military launched a sophisticated campaign aimed at manipulating public perception, both in Vietnam and across the world. This was the era of psychological operations, PSYOPs, a covert strategy designed to shape the attitudes and behaviors of enemy forces, civilians, and even American citizens. The goal was simple: win the war, not just with firepower, but with influence. By the early 1960s, the U.S. military had recognized the importance of controlling the narrative. The U.S. government and military leaders knew that public support for the war was crucial to its success, not just domestically, but also among the civilian population in Vietnam and throughout Southeast Asia. In an age where media and information played an increasingly significant role, the psychological battlefield was just as important as the physical one. Psychological operations in Vietnam were multifaceted, targeting both the Vietnamese and American populations. The ultimate goal was to create confusion, demoralize the enemy, and garner support for the U.S. cause. These operations were based on the belief that the psychological aspect of warfare could be as impactful as any bomb or bullet. The U.S. military understood that if they could shift the morale of the enemy, weaken their will to fight, and influence the population, they might be able to end the conflict on their terms. One of the most well-known and controversial methods of PSYOPs in Vietnam was the use of leaflets. These leaflets were dropped over enemy positions, villages, and towns, delivering messages intended to frighten, confuse, or persuade the Vietnamese population and enemy forces. Some leaflets warned soldiers that they were surrounded and had no chance of escape, urging them to surrender before they were killed. Others threatened severe retribution for continued resistance. These leaflets were designed to prey on fear and vulnerability, capitalizing on the harsh realities of war and the fear of death or punishment. But leaflets were just one part of the operation. The U.S. military also engaged in loudspeaker broadcasts, using large mobile sound systems to broadcast messages into enemy territories. The messages ranged from threats to offers of peace, with the goal of creating confusion and division among the enemy's ranks. These broadcasts were intended to convince the Vietnamese soldiers to abandon their posts and defect, offering them an easy way out from the horrors of battle. It was a psychological weapon aimed at undermining the unity of the enemy forces and destabilizing their morale. In addition to physical tactics like leaflets and loudspeakers, the U.S. military also utilized radio broadcasts aimed at influencing the local population and sowing distrust among the enemy. Radio stations were set up to broadcast propaganda and psychological messages that painted the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and the Viet Cong as brutal, oppressive forces who oppressed their own people. These broadcasts sought to turn the Vietnamese civilians against the communist forces by highlighting their cruelty and highlighting the supposed benefits of supporting the South Vietnamese government. The military also used humiliation tactics as a form of psychological warfare. Captured enemy soldiers would be paraded in front of local villages, shown as examples of the futility of resistance. These public displays were intended to discourage further fighting and send a message to both the enemy and the civilian population that the U.S. was in control. Additionally, captured Viet Cong soldiers would often be forced to participate in propaganda films, where they would denounce the communist cause and pledge allegiance to the South Vietnamese government. These techniques were meant to degrade the enemy's resolve and disrupt their unity. Another highly controversial form of PSYOPs used during the Vietnam War involved the use of counterinsurgency operations, where U.S. forces worked alongside South Vietnamese troops to target villages and local populations that were sympathetic to the communist cause. Psychological operations teams would work in tandem with military units, spreading disinformation to disrupt the communication between villagers and the enemy. In some cases, the U.S. military would also engage in strategic hamlet programs, where villages were relocated or fortified in an attempt to separate the civilian population from the influence of the Viet Cong. These operations not only aimed to win the hearts of the people, but also to ensure that they were physically separated from the insurgents. The psychological warfare tactics didn't end with the Vietnamese population. They were also aimed at the American public. The U.S. government was well aware of the growing opposition to the war at home, especially among younger Americans. The images and stories coming back from the front lines were often filled with brutality, and many Americans were beginning to question the justification for the war. To counter this, the U.S. military engaged in extensive media manipulation to craft a more favorable narrative of the war. The famous body count became a tool of psyops, where U.S. officials would exaggerate the number of enemy soldiers killed in an effort to portray the war as being more successful than it truly was. This was part of a larger propaganda campaign to keep public support for the war intact. PSYOPs operations also sought to influence the opinions of global audiences. In the midst of the Cold War, the U.S. was not just fighting the Vietnam War for its own sake, it was also fighting a war of ideologies. The fear of communism, particularly the rise of Soviet and Chinese influence in Southeast Asia, was ever present. As such, the U.S. sought to portray the conflict as part of the broader fight against communism. These psychological operations were designed to bolster American support for the war and to prevent the Soviet Union and its allies from gaining influence in the region. Despite the effectiveness of PSYOPs, many of these operations had unintended consequences. While they were designed to weaken the morale of the enemy and gain support for the U.S. mission, they often had the opposite effect. The leaflets, loudspeakers, and broadcasts sometimes only served to intensify the resolve of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, who became more determined to resist what they saw as foreign imperialism. In fact, many of the psychological tactics that the U.S. used ended up creating more distrust and hostility, both among the Vietnamese population and the American public. As the war dragged on, the psychological operations used by the U.S. military became a symbol of the war's futility and its tragic cost. The use of propaganda, disinformation, and manipulation revealed the desperate measures that the U.S. government was willing to take to win a war that many had already begun to see as unwinnable. In the end, these psychological operations, designed to shape perceptions and manipulate behavior, became an integral part of a broader conflict that failed to achieve its political objectives, leaving behind a legacy of destruction, disillusionment, and moral compromise. Today, as we look back on the Vietnam War, PSYOPs serve as a haunting reminder of the lengths to which governments will go to shape public perception and win the hearts and minds of both foreign and domestic populations. The Vietnam War may have ended in 1975, but the psychological tactics employed during it continue to influence military and political strategies across the globe. In the midst of World War II, as the world grappled with the chaos and devastation of conflict, an unprecedented scientific and military operation was underway in the United States. This operation, cloaked in secrecy, would change the course of history forever. It was known as the Manhattan Project, a covert initiative that sought to develop the world's first nuclear weapons. But beyond the groundbreaking scientific advancements, the story of the Manhattan Project is also one of the most tightly guarded secrets in modern history. The secrecy surrounding the project, from its inception to the successful detonation of the first atomic bomb, would forever shape the post-war world. The roots of the Manhattan Project can be traced back to a growing fear among Allied nations that Nazi Germany was developing nuclear weapons of its own. In the early 1940s, the U.S. government became increasingly concerned about the potential for Germany to harness the power of atomic energy for military purposes. In response, President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorized the creation of a top-secret research program aimed at developing nuclear weapons before the Nazis could. This decision marked the beginning of a race against time and a desperate bid to create a weapon that could end the war once and for all. The operation was codenamed the Manhattan Project, and its secrecy was absolute. From the very beginning, it was clear that this was not just a military endeavor. It was a massive scientific undertaking that required the collaboration of some of the brightest minds in the world. But even as the project's scope grew, the government took extraordinary measures to ensure that the project's existence remained hidden from the public and the enemy. The scientists and engineers working on the Manhattan Project were told little about the larger goals of the project, or they were given just enough information to perform their tasks, but were kept in the dark about the ultimate purpose of their work. This secrecy was enforced at every level, and those involved in the project were sworn to strict confidentiality. The U.S. government's commitment to keeping the Manhattan Project under wraps was so intense that the workers involved were often unaware of the scale of the operation, or even the fact that they were working on the creation of an atomic bomb. One of the most striking aspects of the Manhattan Project was its compartmentalization. The project was divided into several different locations across the country, each focused on a specific aspect of nuclear research. The primary research facility was located at Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the actual design and construction of the bomb took place. Other key sites included Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, where uranium was enriched and plutonium was produced. These sites were isolated from each other, and personnel at each location were unaware of the work being done at the other facilities. This compartmentalization was meant to limit the risk of leaks. If one part of the project was compromised, the others would still remain secure. The workers at these facilities were under constant surveillance. Their lives were closely monitored, and they were subjected to stringent security checks. Anyone who showed signs of even the smallest breach of security was immediately removed from the project. Even family members were told very little about the nature of the work. Those who worked at Los Alamos, for example, were not allowed to discuss their work with anyone outside the facility, including their spouses. In fact, many workers didn't fully understand the significance of what they were doing until long after the war ended. One of the most famous figures involved in the project was J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer, often referred to as the father of the atomic bomb, was tasked with overseeing the development of the bomb's design. Despite his pivotal role, Oppenheimer was also kept in the dark about certain aspects of the project. His leadership was crucial, but the secrecy surrounding the project was so intense that even he was sometimes left unaware of the larger goals. It was a world in which information was carefully controlled, and knowledge was compartmentalized to the point where even the key figures involved were unaware of the full scope of the weapon they were building. As the project progressed, it became clear that the development of the atomic bomb was not just a scientific breakthrough. It was also a race against the clock. The stakes were incredibly high, and the pressure to succeed was immense. The U.S. government feared that if they didn't develop the bomb first, Nazi Germany or Japan might gain the upper hand. The secrecy surrounding the project reached new heights as the research intensified. At one point, even the U.S. military became involved in the surveillance of the scientists working on the project. It was not just about ensuring the bomb's success. It was also about ensuring that no one could leak any information that might tip off the enemy. The secrecy surrounding the Manhattan Project was so intense that even after the war ended, it remained classified for many years. The American public didn't learn about the existence of the atomic bomb until after the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The bombings were shrouded in controversy, and the secrecy surrounding the project became a subject of intense debate. The decision to use the bomb and the secrecy that surrounded its development would become one of the defining moments of the 20th century. But the legacy of the Manhattan Project didn't end with the bombings. The secrecy in the creation of nuclear weapons would have long-lasting effects on global politics, leading to the Cold War and a new era of nuclear diplomacy. The United States and the Soviet Union would engage in an arms race, each side developing increasingly powerful nuclear weapons in an effort to maintain military superiority. The secrecy of the Manhattan Project set the stage for decades of covert operations and classified research, as nations scrambled to harness the power of the atom. The impact of the Manhattan Project on the global landscape cannot be overstated. The development of nuclear weapons fundamentally changed the way wars were fought and the way nations interacted with one another. The secrecy surrounding the project ensured that the atomic bomb remained an unparalleled weapon of destruction, and it set the stage for the complex world of nuclear politics that would follow. Today, the Manhattan Project is remembered as one of the most ambitious and secretive endeavors in history. It was a project that required extraordinary efforts, boundless scientific innovation, and a level of secrecy that altered the course of history. The decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains a topic of ethical debate, but one thing is certain: the legacy of the Manhattan Project shaped the modern world in ways that no one could have predicted when the project began in 1942. In the shadowed corridors of American scientific history lies a chilling secret, a legacy of experiments so ethically disturbing they defy comprehension. For nearly 5 decades, spanning the 1940s through the 1990s, the U.S. government sanctioned and conducted radiation experiments on unsuspecting civilians, military personnel, hospital patients, and the most vulnerable members of society. These weren't fictional horrors dreamed up for cinema. They were real. They were systematic. And they were hidden behind layers of military classification, red tape, and silence. It began during the height of World War II, amid the fervor of the Manhattan Project. As the race to harness nuclear energy for warfare reached its climax, American scientists and military leaders needed data, real human data, on how radiation affected the human body. The atomic age had dawned, and with it came unrelenting curiosity laced with reckless ambition. But the scientific curiosity quickly devolved into something far more sinister. Human beings were turned into test subjects without their knowledge or consent. In one of the most shocking cases, 18 hospital patients across the United States were secretly injected with plutonium, a radioactive element known for its long-term lethality. These individuals, many of whom were poor, terminally ill, or mentally disabled, were never told what had been placed into their veins. Doctors, some of whom had sworn an oath to do no harm, sat at their bedsides, watching, recording, analyzing. These patients were not dying because of their illnesses. They were being studied as if they were lab rats, poisoned from the inside out. One such patient, known only as Eb Cade, was a 53-year-old African-American man hospitalized for injuries after a car accident. Without his consent, he was injected with 4.7 micrograms of plutonium. Hospital staff even delayed setting his broken bones so the effects of the radiation wouldn't be masked by healing tissue. For weeks, they took samples from his teeth and bones, data that would later inform the government's nuclear weapons protocols. Eb Cade survived the ordeal, but never knew the true reason behind his prolonged suffering. But the horror didn't stop at plutonium. At Vanderbilt University, nearly 800 pregnant women were given radioactive iron drinks under the guise of prenatal care. These women were not told that they were part of an experiment. They trusted their doctors. They trusted the system. But that trust was misplaced. Some of the children born from these pregnancies suffered deformities and died young, victims of radiation exposure before they ever took their first breath. In Cincinnati, terminal cancer patients were subjected to full-body radiation treatments, not for medical benefit, but as part of government-sponsored studies to measure the lethal dose of radiation in humans. Many of these patients were poor, elderly, or mentally compromised. They were told the radiation might help them, but in reality, it was never about healing. It was about data. Cold, calculated, weaponizable data. Some of the patients died within days of exposure. Others endured painful symptoms, withering away under the burden of the invisible poison burning through their cells. In a disturbing twist, children were also targeted. At the Fernald State School in Massachusetts, children labeled as mentally deficient were fed radioactive oatmeal as part of a study funded by both the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission and Quaker Oats. These boys had no idea what they were consuming. They were told they were part of a science club. They were promised field trips and extra food. Instead, they were used as tools to study the absorption of calcium and iron in the human body. The deception was so elaborate that even their parents were kept in the dark. All of this, hidden from public knowledge. For decades, the victims had no voice. Their suffering was buried beneath bureaucratic language, stamped with the seal of national security, and stored in government archives. It wasn't until the 1990s, when investigative journalists and whistleblowers began to uncover the truth, that the full scope of these atrocities began to surface. The American public was stunned. A government that had promised to protect its people had instead experimented on them, without consent, without warning, and without remorse. In 1994, President Bill Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, launching a nationwide investigation. Thousands of declassified documents revealed the scope of the experimentation. Over 4,000 radiation tests involving more than 20,000 people, many of whom were children, prisoners, soldiers, and the mentally ill. The findings were damning. The government had prioritized military advancement over basic human rights, reducing its own citizens to expendable variables in a deadly equation. Clinton publicly apologized on behalf of the U.S. government, stating, "The United States of America offers a sincere apology to those of our citizens who were subjected to these experiments, to their families, and to their communities." But the apology, though significant, came too late for many. Lives had been destroyed, generations affected, trust shattered. The legacy of the human radiation experiments is more than a dark chapter in American history. It's a stark reminder of what can happen when science is pursued without ethics, when secrecy outweighs humanity, and when those in power decide that some lives are worth sacrificing for the illusion of national security. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a broader pattern of scientific arrogance and governmental indifference. And while many of the victims' names have been lost to time, their suffering stands as a silent testimony to what happens when the quest for knowledge becomes entangled with the machinery of war. Their pain was real, their deaths were real, and their stories demand to be remembered.